Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was a Servant to the Prince? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Hello there. Welcome to my first BGMI/amateur reader insert fanfic. Just a few quick things before you continue with this story. First, I am basing the main plot on one of my all-time favorite movies based on the Cinderella story. It is called Ever After, a Cinderella story. It stars Drew Barrymore, whom I love very much. If you have never seen this movie, I highly recommend it. The storyline is fantastic and the talent is amazing. Plus, who wouldn't want Angelica Houston to be their evil stepmother? Try to place our lovely MHA characters in the roles that I thought best fit them. Obviously Midnight and Cammy will be OOC because I chose them to play the evil stepsister and mother, but other than that they should be the only two that won't be like they are written. Second, ships. Please, 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 do not come at me about the relationships I have chosen to use in the story. I know how crazy this fandom gets about shipping, and I really do not want to deal with that negativity. I am not really a shipper when it comes to anything, but I am choosing relationships I feel will work best with the storyline and the way I set the roles of the characters. If you disagree with me, please keep that to yourself and just read the story, which is first and foremost a romance between our appealing Shuto and reader. The romance between other characters does not interfere with the plot line, so chilly. Lastly, ages. Reader is 8 in the beginning and then there is a 10-year jump. Shuto, Izuku, and Katsuki are 3 years older than the reader. Mina, Ijiro, and Tsuyu will be 5 years older than the reader. Ochako is a year older than the reader, while Cammy is 2 years older. And Jairu are the same age as the reader. I don't know why, but I always like to make characters' ages known because to me it's important for my brain to know how old people are. It's a weird detail to emphasize on, but whatever. Here is a list of the roles from the movie the MHA characters will be replacing. Danielle, Aizawa, reader. Prince Henry, Todoroki, Shuto. Baroness Radmilla, Kayama, Namuri, Midnight. Leonardo da Vinci, Hatsum, Marguerite, Kayama, Cammy. Jacqueline, Kayama, King Francis, Todoroki, Enji. Queen Marie, the queen is Rei, but because she is awaits, Fuyumi will be in that place. Instead, she's not queen but she's that role if you know what I mean. Auguste, Father Izawa, Shoyuda, Dadzawa Hihi. Gustave, Bakugu, Katsuki. Paulette, Ashui, Tiu. Louise, Ashido Mina. Maurice, Kirishima Iger. Pierre Lepew, Shigaraki, Tamura. Captain Lauron, Midoriya, Izuku. Royal Guard, Ida, Tenya. Royal Page, Nasty Little BS Mineta. The only reason I'm leaving him in this story is because he gets hit in the head with a pot. Princess Gabriella, Yaoyorozu Momo. Princess Gabriella's lover, Jairu, Kyuka. Gypsy Thief, Kaminari, Denki. Gypsy Leader, Siro, Hanta. I really encourage comments, and if there are any misspellings or weird sentences that I missed, please feel free to kindly let me know so I can edit the mistakes. I am a little nervous about posting a MHA fanfic because I have seen other great writers quit their stories because the hate was so bad. I really don't want that to be the case for me, so please be kind to each other and don't start shipping wars. Dear God, I cannot stress this enough. Do not start shipping wars. Please. Domo arigoto? Darth Zana. Once upon a time, there was a girl who loved her father very much. The farm was lively today. All the servants and farmhands were hustling and bustling around the manor in excitement. The emissary was set to return today and it was nearing the time he would arrive. In a beautifully but modest, decorated room on the second floor, 2 young housemaids were chasing a rather headstrong, excited girl around the room. Although Mina and Tsuyu were a mere 5 years older than the 8-year-old MSDR's daughter, they were quite mature for their age. That didn't seem to bother the young girl, as she made it a point to keep the two teens on their toes constantly. Even though the young Alice was a handful, the two maids loved her as if she were their own sister, and there was never a dull moment in her presence. The feeling was mutual from the young reader Aizawa. She was probably the happiest young girl in all the land. She had friends she got to see every day, and a father who brought home new books and tales from his travels around the country. Not to mention she was to gain not only a new mother, but two sisters as well today. Having grown all her short life without a mother has been hard, but this did not deter Reader one bit. Her father was always there for her, and treated her with such love and kindness. Mr. Shoyuda Aizawa was known by others as a strong but emotionless man, who spoke with a deep slow drawl that annoyed some people, but to Reader he always had a kind smile on his face, and his voice alone could lull her to sleep. Everyone around him could see how much he loved and cared for his child. They just knew that the wife Aizawa had chosen would truly be a loving, appealing woman. Not to mention that she was a baroness, nonetheless. A woman of noble blood. The MSTR deserved nothing less. Oi, get out here already. Reader stopped in her tracks, standing on her bed while Mina was stretching across it, hanging onto the girl's left ankle. The sound of her best friend, kindly, calling out to her caught her attention. She shook her ankle from Tsuyu's grasp, which caused her to release it with a disgruntled huff. This made Mina erupt in quiet giggles from the other side of the room. Reader hopped off the bed and ran to her window that faced the manor's courtyard. She looked down to the ground to see the spiky pale blonde-haired Katsuki Baku. His fiery red eyes were filled with annoyance and his arms were crossed tightly around him. No matter what people thought, that fluffy ball of anger was one of her most favorite people in the world. Katsuki may have spent most of his time trying to pick fights with her and yelling obscenities after every other word, but he was Reader's oldest and closest friend. Plus, deep down, he had a heart of gold. He was just very passionate. Must be an artist thing, thought Reader now, as she smiled widely at her friend, and he merely returned a friendly scowl back to her. Then Reader remembered that she would not be able to play with Katsuki today because her father would be returning soon with her new family in tow. Reader is pretty sure that she told Katsuki this, but he looked like he wanted to play fight again, and it's hard for Reader to pass up an opportunity to beat him, but she must resist. Mina and Tsuyu worked hard to make her look presentable in one of her nicest dresses. It was long, so long it reached past her toes and dragged on the ground. It was a lovely olive green color with long puffy white sleeves that made her want to pretend to be a pirate like in one of those books her father brought home with him once. Katsuki, didn't I tell you that I could not play today? Reader was fully aware that she was speaking so loud that nearly the entire grounds could hear her. Nearby farm hands turned their heads towards the two loud children, but merely shrugging it off and returning to their duties. This, after all, was a normal occurrence between the two. I don't give a ding, as he paused, finally taking a look at what you were wearing. It was a shock to say the least. Oi, you look like a girl. That's what I am, half-wit, she shouted back. Yeah, but today you look it. It's even weird. Bakug, language, the two heard Kirishima yell. The ray of sunshine was always trying to teach the 11-year-old manners and proper words, but the explosive boy continued to ignore him. Well, Reader continued with a huff, whether I am a boy or girl, I could still W you. I'd like to see you try, This sparked the inner troublemaker in Reader. With a large, devious smile on her face, she quickly ran out of her room, making sure to stay clear of Mina's and Sue's flailing arms. Ignoring their desperate squeals, she ran downstairs, out the front door, and started to chase Katsuki, who, as soon as he saw her, made a beeline for the back of the manor. The sound of horse hooves and carriage wheels could be heard over the manor's courtyard. The farm hands started to shout to the servants from outside that the emperor was coming. Everyone started to rush outside to line up next to the front door to watch Aizawa make his last leg home, but it wasn't just him and his traders this time. Aizawa was leading his travel party in the front, alone, on his horse. Behind him rolled a simple, dark wood carriage. In it held the long-awaited, new wife and her two daughters. The servants began to whisper in excitement as the travel party got closer to the manor's courtyard. A certain redhead, however, kept looking around for a certain young girl who was supposed to be here to introduce herself to her new family. Mina, have you seen Reader recently? Kirishima turned to Mina on his right as he asked her this question. She and Tsuyu looked almost guilty, but this was normal behavior for the small child. They were sure she would pop up at the last minute right before her father arrived. As she always does. Last time I saw her she was chasing Bakugo around in the backfield, but I haven't seen her for a few minutes now. Oh dear, I really hope she doesn't get dirty again, Mina fretted. She and Tsuyu had put so much effort in trying to make that child look presentable today for the Baroness, but she should have known that they couldn't stop the girl from running around and creating mischief. Having been raised by a man made it hard for a girl to act like a proper lady. Mina just hopes that the Baroness finds the young girl's antics endearing as much as her father does. Well, I'm sure she will be here shortly, dismissed Kirishima. In a few more minutes the emissary would be here, and she'll come running over as she normally does. The servants continued chatting amongst themselves until Aizawa was past the manor's courtyard entrance and was in hearing range. Kirishima walked towards him and waited for Aizawa to grab his horse for him. Welcome, home to Aizawa. He greeted the stoic and very exhausted-looking man when he stopped right before Kirishima. I hope your travels went as planned? Ah yes, Kirishima. Everything went according to plan, but I seem to have brought home a bit more baggage than usual it seems, the man joked in a bored, emotionless tone. Kirishima gave a kind laugh while he grabbed the horse's reins from Aizawa's hands and helped him off the horse. Would you mind helping grab the luggage when they are all inside for me, Kirishima? Of course, sir. It's what I am here for, Kirishima answered with a bright smile. He was always surprised when the emissary asked for servants to do things for him instead of ordering them. It was almost as if Aizawa thought of them as equals, and Kirishima was very thankful for that. Having come from a family that treated their servants cruelly, Kirishima was very thankful, indeed, to have been lucky enough for Aizawa to have hired him. He has only been here for a year, but he has made more lasting relationships in this small manor than he had anywhere else in his 13 years of life before he worked for Aizawa. After Kirishima grabbed the horse from Aizawa, the MSTR looked around at everyone, looking for his young child, but it seemed that she was nowhere in sight. Where on earth is my daughter? Did she get distracted once again, Mina and Tsu? Bakugo might have come to visit again, answered Tsuyu in her usual nasally bland tone. Well, no matter, we'll get the introductions done first and find her soon. At that moment the coachman got down and opened the door for the mysterious three ladies inside. He held out his hand and a tiny little pale one popped out to hold on to it. Attached to the hand came out a small child with short cropped brown hair. Her face and eyes were round and she had very pink cheeks. Her head was adorned with a rose-pink veil and she wore a matching rose-pink casual gown. She looked kindly at the others and observed the surrounding area with interest. She looked to be roughly a year older than the MSDR's child. She stepped to her right and waited for the rest of her family to make it out of the carriage. The next girl had medium-length pale blonde hair. Everyone could tell that even at her young age she would be a beauty when she grew. Her face was oval-shaped with her eyes a very dark brown. She also adorned a veil on her head, but hers was a dark blue, and her gown was exactly the same as her sister's, but matched her veil. The older sister didn't seem to have a very good first impression of the manor and its servants, for when she hopped out of the carriage, her tiny nose scrunched up in disgust. Once outside she stepped to her left and made way for her mother to step out of the carriage. Everyone watched as a full-grown, delicate hand flitted from the carriage and with it emerged one of the most appealing women the manor has ever seen. Her presence made all the men stand straighter, and the fellow women fix their skirts. Her hair was long and black, the color of midnight if the night sky was vacant of stars and the moon. Her eyes were a appealing sky blue and her features were soft, but she held an almost exotic and SXL air. She wore a black casual gown with an off-white mid-length veil that was attached to a large black headband on top of her head. She gave an almost amused grin to the servants and the manor's front profile. Why, Shoyuta, this place is simply charming. I do truly adore it, she said in a voice that was smooth and soft. Her voice sounded how a soft caress from a lover would feel, and it made the surrounding servants either largely aroused or very relaxed. Aizawa smirked slightly at her observation before turning to his servants and saying, "Everyone, I would like to introduce you to our newest members of the family. Please give your warmest welcome to Ochako Kiyama." He motioned to the round-faced girl first, then moved his arm towards the blonde girl. He said, "Kami Kiyama, and my new appealing wife, Namuri Kiyamezawa." All the servants gave low bows to the ladies, and it was at the moment they all heard a loud yell of happiness, and a very dirty child dressed in what was an olive-green gown, was now stained in dark brown mud. "Papa!" Reader yelled as she ran to her father in a fit of giggles. Aizawa turned with the largest smile on his face to his beloved daughter and grabbed her when she ran into his arms. He picked her up, and when she was face to face with him she said, "I missed you. You have been gone for far too long, Papa." The Baroness watched the exchange with a calm, stoic expression. The two stepsisters watched with amusement and couldn't believe that a young girl was wearing so much mud on her clothes. Her appearance merely made the emir laugh as he kissed her lovingly on the cheek. "I missed you very much too, my angel, but I was hoping to present a little lady. I am assuming Bakugu is around here somewhere looking just as bad, if not worse." He now looked behind his child and saw that, indeed, Katsuki was covered in mud as well, and held a face of pure malice. He would most likely be back tomorrow for another round. "Well, I guess you will have to do." He placed Reader back on her feet and faced her towards her new family. He gave another round of introductions. The Baroness gracefully swiped her hands together and looked at her now stepdaughter with indifference. "Reader, at last we meet. Your father speaks of nothing else," she properly announced. With a slight turn to her head she continued, "Ladies, say hello to your new stepsister." For the rest of the afternoon the newly arrived family took time to get settled and rest from their long and tiring journey. Reader spent most of her time being scolded by Mina and Tsuyu about how it is not proper for a young lady to fight with boys and get covered in mud as they helped her bathe and change her clothes. The young girl merely rolled her eyes and let them. She was too excited from meeting her new mother and sisters to really care. Reader was never one to care much for what people thought of her in general. She just figured that the people who were willing to deal with her free spirit were worth the effort on her part, because they were willing to put in the effort on her part. Yes, Mina and Tsuyu scolded Reader from time to time, but they did it with love, and they understood that she most likely would not listen. She also had her father who loved her unconditionally and let her act the way she wished. Just as long as she was not rude and put others down, of course. The housemaids were now dressing Reader in another rather nice dress. It was in her favorite color and it also had the big white puffy sleeves that she loved so much. She made a mental note to ask Mina to sew up some shirts so she could play pirates with Katsuki sometime. It might take some time to convince him, but she was sure that if she brought out the wooden swords the young abrasive artist would have no choice but to agree. He loved to whack things with a wooden sword. It seemed to always bring him great happiness. It was the small things that brought great joy to the pale blonde boy. "There, dear, you are presentable once again," sighed Mina. She sounded awfully tired, and it made Reader feel a little bad for making them have to get her ready twice today, but she really does enjoy kicking Katsuki's butt in play fighting, so she figures that, until the day she dies, she will drop everything to beat Katsuki. Even in the mud. Because that is what true friendship is. To WHP her best friend in the mud and watch as he curses her with every known swear word he has in his little brain and then chases her around the grounds until he catches her and the two begin fighting again. Yes, that is it. True friendship. "Thank you Mina and Tsu for helping me clean up, again," the young Ethis sang to her two friends. They smiled and hugged Reader and told her to go do her studies and read while they prepared dinner. Reader went downstairs to the family room and sat in a lounge chair right by the fireplace where she left her copy of The Fairy Queen, one of the many books her father had brought her from his journeys across the country. Reader prided herself in her ability to read books more mature for her age. She always felt important when someone complimented her on her knowledge. It gave her something to be proud of besides her father's trading and accomplishments. So that's where Reader sat, reading her poem, until dinner was served. It was now bedtime. Reader was all snuggled in her nightgown and her father was tucking her into bed. Dinner was rather enjoyable for the young girl. Her new mother and sisters were so elegant and mature. They ate dinner like it was a dance, their movements slow and precise. Reader was entranced by their ability to be so regal, and wonders if she could be like that too someday. Maybe being a proper woman is not such a terrible idea, after all. However, even Reader knows her personality is a little too strong to be slow and precise. But she can still dream about being a proper lady even though she knows she never will be one. Reader, Shoyuta began as he sat on the side of Reader's bed and brought out what he was hiding in his pocket. I have brought you another book home. He hands the small copy of a new hardcover book in a off-white color and gold lettering for the title. He pointed to the title and said, Utopia, it means paradise. I thought we could add it to your library. As always it is considered quite thick for an 8-year-old, but I know you will be able to handle it. Reader took the novel in glee and gave her father a large smile. The book was very nice, and she just knew it was going to be good because her father picked it just for her. Will you read some? Reader asked with large eyes. She loved the sound of her father's voice when he read her to sleep. It always calmed her hyperactive mind and lulled her to sleep. Not tonight, my dear, it has been a very long day, he answered with a tired smile. Shoyuta always tried his hardest to hide how utterly exhausted he was from his many travels for his daughter, but this particular one was a little stressful with having to bring home extra people and a carriage. And you are a husband now, the daughter sang. This made Shoyuta laugh softly and say, but a father first and forever. He started to gently pet his daughter's hair out of her face, and looked down at her with as much love as a father could give his child. He quietly sighed before continuing, we have been 2 peas in a pod for a very long time. I suppose this will take some time getting used to? Reader nodded her head enthusiastically and wiggled happily before saying, did you see the way they ate their supper? It was perfect, Papa. Like a dance. She giggled sweetly. Reader's happiness made Shoyuta smile wider, and he felt very thankful that his daughter was so open to having a new mother and sisters. Do you like them? Very much, Reader answered with a wide smile. Good, because I have to go to Avignon in a fortnight. Shoyuta felt bad having to give this sad news. It felt like he was constantly traveling, and more traveling meant less time with his beloved daughter. But you just got back, the child whined. I know, sighed Shoyuta. For how long? Only, the father trailed off trying to sum up an approximate time PRD. 3 weeks. 1, Reader argued. 2, Shudo argued right back. 1. This stubborn child, Shoyuta thought to himself as he playfully rolled his eyes, then continued to try to show authority to his child. 2. Reader gave him the stink eye for another minute longer, and the next thing he knew he lost in a game of rock, paper, scissors with his daughter choosing paper and he rock. He gave a very over-exaggerated sigh before smiling at his stubborn child and saying, all right, 1. Shoyuta stood up from the Reader's bed and turned to kiss her on the head. And finished tucking her in. He gave her one more smile before continuing, go to sleep, I'll see you in the morning. Good night. Good night, Papa. The too short of a fortnight had passed, but Reader and her father spent it well. Between new lessons with her stepmother and fencing lessons with her father, Reader felt that her new family life was going to be great. The Baroness treated her with kindness, and Ochako was becoming a quick friend. She was having a difficult time connecting with Kami, but Reader was sure that she would warm up to her sooner or later. Katsuki came by once in a while, but he had just been accepted as an apprentice for a local artist, so he was more busy working on his craft and did not have as much time to play with Reader. But they did get to play pirates the other day, and her father even played the sea monster. Plus, even Ochako joined in on the fun. Now, however, everyone, the family, farmhands and servants, were all out in the courtyard watching sadly as the emperor once again gave a farewell to his family. This time he had more women who will miss him while he is gone. At this moment he was embracing his wife as he gave her a light kiss on the cheek. I shall be back in a week, he whispered to Nemuri. She was visibly pouting, but his words and loving hold seemed to calm her. Then go, she smiled at him sweetly and continued, the sooner you leave, the sooner we can celebrate your return. With one more light kiss on her lips, Shoyuta moved on to his two new stepdaughters. He had grown rather fond of the two in the past 2 weeks. Although Kami was rather more closed off than Ochako, the father could tell that she was finally beginning to open up to him. You too, I will miss as well. He gave them one of his kind smiles that he held only for those he loves dearly and said, I hope you all grow even more closer as I am gone. I expect all 4 of you to be best of friends when I return. The 2 girls and their mothers smiled back at him with adoration. Kami and Ochako never really knew their late father, and the memories they have of him were blurry, but Shoyuta was able to become their dear father figure easily in a measly 2 weeks. They would really miss him while he was gone. Shoyuta finally turned to his ever-growing impatient daughter. Rita was awfully quiet for her normal behavior. She always grew very upset having to watch her father leave for his work trips. Even though she had more family to spend her time with while he was gone, he was still the only blood-related family she had, and him being away always instilled this fear that he might not ever come back. My sweet child, do not look so upset, he kindly chided. I will be back before you know it. Spend this week teaching your new sisters and mother how things work around here. He bent down, balancing on his heels, and leaned towards Rita in a conspiratorial manner and whispered, The Baroness is not used to getting her hands dirty. This made Rita smile as she watched Namuri turn away and wipe the invisible dirt off her hands. Merely proving what the father said. Shoyuta gave a light kiss on Rita's cheek before standing back up and heading to his horse. Kirishima, who was waiting for him, handed him the reins to his noble steed. However, when Shoyuta grabbed the reins, he started to feel an unknown pain in his left arm. He assumed he was sore from his latest fencing lesson with Rita, and he merely shrugged it off. He had a job to do after all. Have a safe journey, Desarizawa, Kirishima said kindly while giving his signature smile. He always found the MSDR's dedication to his work very manly, and always hoped that when he was his age he would have a family that he could provide well for and who loved him just as much. Thank you, Kirishima. Keep the manner together while I am gone. After saying this, Shoyuta mounted his horse, and with a final goodbye and wave he began to ride along the dirt road to the entrance gate. Everyone patiently watched him slowly make his way except one. Come along, ladies. Back to your lessons, the Baroness commanded before clapping twice and began walking inside. The 2 sisters turned to follow her. Wait! Rita exclaimed, trying to stop Namuri before she disappeared inside. It's tradition. Papa always waves at the gate. Namuri just shrugged at the young child and continued her journey inside with her 2 daughters in tow. This upset Rita, and she ran to the edge of the courtyard to get a better view of her father and his ride to the gate. At this very moment she watched her father double over in pain and then fall completely off his horse. Rita yelled and began running to him. Being a small child, all she could do was slowly move him back and forth, unable to turn him on his back. She began crying because her father wasn't moving and he wasn't saying anything. Why isn't he saying anything? Rita cried in her head. Namuri came running after hearing Rita's cry. When she reached the child and her husband she grew very worried, and knelt down next to Shoyuta. She helped Rita turn him on his left side where he was facing Namuri. Shoyuta, she pleaded, can you hear me, my love? Shoyuta, say something. Shuta's eyes slowly opened. He looked at Namuri, but it seemed as if her face could not be processed in his mind. Noticing a smaller presence on his other side, he turned to where he was lying on his back and looked at his daughter. He felt an immense pain in his chest, and he knew his time was near. He truly wished that he could have seen his lovely child grow up. He wished he could have seen her fall in love and marry, have children of her own, but he let her down. He would not get to be there for her anymore. He will have to leave her like her mother left her after child BR. Too early. Shoyuta hoped that she would be able to move on and learn to be happy again. Shoyuta slowly and painfully moved his right hand to his daughter's cheek before voicing his final words, the only words he can think of, I love you. With one final breath, the light in Shuta's eyes died. Rita held onto his hand so it wouldn't fall and began sobbing. Namuri was in such shock at first that her own husband chose his daughter over her, but then the dread set in. He just left her alone in a country manor, and no way of gaining income. She began to shake in anger and sadness and yelled, "You cannot leave me here." She repeated this mantra until she started to sob in the arms of Kirishima, who came to help counsel her. Mina and Tsuyu came and tried to pull Rita away from her father's now corpse, but the child refused to move. It seemed her father wasn't returning in a week after all. It would be 10 years before another man would enter her life. A man who was still ABOY in many, many ways. Todoroki Shuto, crowned prince of the Mizutofu kingdom, was setting his plan of escaping from his father's clutches in motion once again. The young man was currently tying together an abundance of bed sheets he found in the washroom, from one end to the other. He was hoping they were clean, but freedom was more important now. Shuto could not give a specific number of the amount of times he has attempted to run away now, but he could say that this time it would work. He could feel it down to his bones that his new attempt would be a success this time around. He would finally be able to get out of this kingdom and live the life he's always wanted to. Ever since Shuto was young, his father has kept him in the seclusion of the palace. Now that Shuto was older, however, to keep up appearances, King Enji had no choice but to bring Shuto around Mizutofu for the public to get to know their future king. It took years for the villagers to get used to the appearance of the young prince. Though many of the people held strange facial structures and eye colors, no one was prepared to see a boy with heterochromia hair, split into two, one side red and the other white. Not to mention his striking heterochromia eyes of one turquoise and the other gray, but what caught the attention of the villagers the most was his large burn scar that obscured the left side of his eye. Only 5 people knew the true nature of Shuto's scar. His father, his mother, his sister, his best friend and personal guard Izuku Midoriya, and Shuto himself. Shuto always knew that it was his father's cruelty to him and his family that caused his mother so much trauma to physically injure Shuto. He never blamed his mother for what she did, but it did make the hate he had for his father burn far more brighter than any fire could hope to reach. Not only did King Enji destroy his family, but he sent his wife on a much-needed vacation to get the relaxation she needed. That was 16 years ago now. It didn't help that the king now wanted to mend things with his family, and his attempts annoyed the 21-year-old greatly. He believed that his father didn't deserve redemption, and the only way to not deal with having to listen to his father's unbearable small talk and abrasive personality is to run away. Also, being a socially awkward, quiet, angsty young man didn't take to the public very well. Besides from women who deemed him the most attractive man in all of the kingdom, he was not very liked by many others. He made it a point to ignore the other courtiers to spite his father, and it was not difficult to do because the majority of people in court were terribly boring and pompous a-holes. The only person he tolerated was his sister, Fuyumi, but she did not count because she was family and he actually got along with her. Plus, his father, the worst of the court, was trying to wed him off to a woman he did not even know. Shuto's bedchamber door opened to reveal Izuku, his personal guard and best friend. They merely shared a look before Izuku rolled his eyes, but didn't protest. As mentioned before, this is not the first time the prince had escaped. Izuku had gotten used to the sight of an empty bed and handwritten letters to his sister explaining that he had run away again. He believes that the servants left bed sheets in the washroom specifically for Shuto now to see how long he could get away from the castle. Izuku, himself, might have also started a few bets here and there on whether the prince's attempt would work this time, but the guard always managed to find Shuto. Because, let's admit it, the prince was terrible at running away. Just promise to not get into any trouble, Your Highness, sighed Izuku as he returned to the hall and shut the door quietly behind him after Shuto had nodded his head yes as an answer. With his makeshift rope of bed sheets finally completed, Shuto rushed to the window closest to his bed and opened it. He tied an end of the rope to a leg of his bed, and once he made sure it was tight and secure enough for his body weight, he threw the rest of the rope out the window and watched as it naturally unfolded and swayed gently in the breeze. Satisfied with the length, Shuto grabbed his cloak and set it on his shoulders, making sure to put up his hood so no one would easily recognize him. He climbed on his windowsill and wrapped his legs around the rope and began descending to the ground below. At the bottom he had a few feet left where the rope did not meet the ground, but it was not concerning, so Shuto just jumped the rest of the way. When his feet hit the grass, he immediately started to run to the stables where he had a horse prepared for his escape. Once settled in the saddle on the horse's back, Shudo snapped the reins and raced out of the castle's courtyard. Through the rush of the wind, he swore he heard his frustrated father's yell of his name. Once Shudo made it well into the countryside of the kingdom, he began to look for a small farm or stable that held horses. He needed to replace his royal horse with a common one in order to not look suspicious. Eventually, he came across a small, relatively well-kept-together manor that was far enough from civilization for his approval. It also held a stable with a few horses to choose from. Making sure no one was around, he quickly dismounted his steed and walked towards the first horse he saw. It seemed he should have been more observant in the horse he chose. This one in particular was well-mannered, but it must have been much older than he thought it was, or it just refused to go any faster than its current speed. It seemed a swift form of borrowing a horse was not in the books today. He started to get frustrated with the horse and began to yell in annoyance for the horse to go faster, but this horse seemed to have something rather hard hit Shudo square in the face, causing him to fully roll backwards off the horse and land on his back on the ground hard. After a few seconds of catching his breath and blinking a few times, he began to hear a young woman scolding. His ears were a little fuzzy from the fall, so her words went right over his head. Making sure to cover his face and hair in his cloak's hood, he began to stand and try to look for said screaming girl. That's when he began to be pelted with even more hard objects. "You thief! How dare you try and steal my father's horse?" Shudo could definitely understand the voice now. He began to attempt to make his way to the very loud woman, but she kept throwing apples? She was really throwing apples at him? Shudo was not the best at communicating, but it seemed at this point he had no choice. If someone was willing to throw their apples at him, then they might deserve an explanation, he supposed. "Please, Miss Dash," he was momentarily interrupted when an apple hit him straight across his forehead. He tried to keep his hood over his face, but at this time it seemed to hinder the situation more than help it, but he needed his identity to stay a secret, so he kept on. "Miss, please, I needed to whack thunk my horse. It shoe thunk." That particular one hit where the sun did not shine and had Shudo double over in pain. The woman seemed to use this opportunity to WHP another apple right on his back, making him jump forward. "Where the hell is she?" "Miss, I had no choice." He finally managed to get a full sentence out, but this merely made the woman scoff and throw another well-aimed apple at his knee. "And what? Our choice is to just let you." "I was just borrowing it," he countered. He was not a thief, but in all honesty, if his plan of escape actually worked, he could not think of a way he would be able to bring back a horse to a place he had no intention of returning to, but she did not need to know that. "Leave now or I'll wake the house." This made the prince pause. If she was merely a servant, then all he needed to do was show himself, and she would have no choice but to stay silent for him. With his new sense of authority, Shudo turned to where he believed the woman was and angrily flipped off his hood. She appeared to be rather young, maybe a few years younger than Shudo. Her hair was H/C, but it was rather greasy. In fact, her whole person was rather dirty. It looked as if she worked too hard for her own good, and never took the time to sit and clean herself. She wore a plain, navy blue dress that had seen better days. Shudo felt rather bad for her, but she was a servant and it was her job to get dirty. Plus, his priority was trying to get away from Yuzudafu, and right now she was preventing that. Recognition flashed in her /C eyes, and her face immediately formed into one of fear. This made Shudo feel even worse because it was not her fault that he was forced to attempt to run away from his problems, and now was forced to use his station to make her do as he says. He watched as she knelt to the ground in a hurry and began to apologize. Please forgive me, Your Highness," she said as she placed her dirty hands on the ground in front of her. "I did not see you. Your aim would suggest otherwise." He saw her visibly cringe at his straightforwardness. Of course she did not see him as the prince, but she did see him. It just happened to be that the thief was actually someone of high importance, and now she was screwed. "And for that I know I must die." This shocked Shudo. Of course, it was known that if someone attempted to physically harm the royal family, their assailant would be sent to death, but this was a misunderstanding. Were people really that untrustworthy of him that they thought he would not forgive someone for not realizing he was the prince? Shudo was never outwardly cruel to anyone, but it did hurt his feelings to know that someone who has never met him would think he would just automatically choose death for them as punishment. There is no need for that, he sighed. All I ask is that you speak of this to no one and I'll let you go on with your life. The servant girl looked up at him in shock, but nodded her head in understanding. Seeing her face closer, Shudo observed that she was actually quite pretty, but she did smell strongly of soot and dirt. Forcing himself to look away and retrieve the horse he lost during this strange interlude of his escape, he began to walk around the young woman. "We have other horses, Your Highness," she whispered, afraid to speak any louder, "younger ones, and more agile. If that is your wish." "My wish is to be free of my gilded cage," he said rather haughtily. He got an idea all of a sudden, and began untying his pouch of coins he kept tied to his belt. Throwing the pouch on the ground in front of the woman, he said, "For your silence." Without another glance, he mounted the horse that caused this whole ordeal, and continued his journey to the edge of the kingdom. After roughly a half-hour of riding, Shudo was faced with another obstacle in the shape of a trashed carriage with gypsies and a very loud pink-haired woman running around grabbing things. "Please, I beg you," cried the pinkette, "don't take my babies." Babies? Shudo knew that she was not referring to actual babies, but the phrasing was still a little strange. As Shudo neared the commotion, he slowed the horse down to a trot, and hoped that they were all too preoccupied with each other to notice him. Shudo was still trying to run away, and did not wish to be interrupted again. But he seemed to be asking the impossible today because the woman came running to him in a state of panic. "Please, sir," she begged when she stepped in front of his horse, making him have to stop in the middle of the road. At this exact same time he heard the royal guard yelling in the distance. No doubt the pink-haired woman had sent someone to fetch the local watch to help stop the thieves. The sound of the guards had the gypsies rushing around and running away, making the woman even more frantic for a particular item a yellow-haired gypsy just took. "That man took one of my precious babies. Can you please stop him? Please?" Uncomfortable with this whole situation and the fact that he saw his best friend and another close friend, Tenya Ida, within the group of royal guards added to his anxiety. He wanted to rush out of there and create as much distance between them as he possibly could. He forced himself to look the distraught woman in the eyes and say, "The royal guard will help you." "I cannot." "Oh, please, 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 sir." This woman clearly held not one single ounce of shame. "It is my life." Shudo took one last glance at the thief getting away, and looked again at the nearing royal guard before looking back at the pink-haired woman. At this point Shudo thought, F it. He had to face the fact that he was going to be caught anyway. He swore under his breath before aggressively snapping the horse's reins and chasing after the gypsy that had mounted their own horse at this point and had a pretty good head start. It took a few minutes for Shudo to catch up to him. At this point Shudo's hood had fallen off his head, but he couldn't care less if he was recognized at this point. When he neared the gypsy, Shudo rode to the left side of his horse and grabbed at the man's shoulder. The item that he was risking his freedom for was what appeared to be a long tube usually used to hold canvas paper paintings. So, the woman must be some artist then, thought Shudo as he attempted to reach for said tube. The yellow-haired gypsy forced his horse into the side of Shudo's, making him veer off course of the forest road. This irritated the young prince. Was it really so hard to just run away from your problems? Why can't he just be allowed peace and freedom for once? Leading his horse back to the side of the gypsy, he gave up any attempt to snatch the tube and decided to just jump onto the man instead. This may have been a big mistake. The two grown men fell off the horse and, unbeknownst to Shudo, there was a cliff above a small lake just beyond the foliage. Shudo's tackle and their fall caused both men to slide and roll over the cliff's edge and fall straight into the water below. Leaves slowly fell around them as the gypsy man completely gave up on the assumed painting and swam to shore, away from the now very livid Prince Shudo. Once Shudo retrieved the tube and horse, he made his way back to where the pink-haired woman was still waiting for him by her nearly destroyed carriage. Izuku and Tenya were standing next to her and they seemed to be having an interesting conversation. Once Izuku noticed Shudo, he gave one of his signature large smiles that just made the prince huff in annoyance and roll his eyes. Plans of escape have once again been thwarted. Shuto, you promised, scolded his green-haired, green-eyed friend. Yeah? Why lied? Shuto walked up to the woman and moved the tube in her grasp. The women gave a long, loud, joyous squeal and immediately began to open the tube, claiming they needed it to dry off so it would not get ruined. You know, Shuto continued in an annoyed tangent that just made Tenya and Izuku give him look. I thought I'd see the world before I gave up my life to God and country. This made the woman laugh loudly as they continued to pull out what was definitely a painting. She glanced over at Shuto with a large smile and a glint in her strange green-yellow colored eyes before saying, "Why did you stop?" "I suppose I lack conviction," he muttered. For some reason this loud female was easy to talk to. He made an exaggerated groan before continuing, "You, however, seem to have it in spades." He took a step forward, curiosity taking the better of him as he tried to get a glimpse of what he wasted his freedom on. "Besides, you claimed it was a matter of life and death." She giggled at that. After completely revealing the painting to Shuto, she said, "A woman always is, sire." The woman in said painting had long black hair, pale skin, and a European look to her. She was rather plain, but her face held the slightest smile. Shuto narrowed his eyes at the painting and with another huff said, "She laughs at me, miss, as if she knows something I do not. The lady had many secrets. I merely painted one." Shuto watched as the woman laid the painting on a piece of luggage to finish drying as Izuku stepped forward. Shuto turned to look at him and waited for what he had to say. "This is Hatsum Mei," Izuku introduced. "She has been invited to the palace as the resident artist." "The Hatsum Mei?" Shuto was shocked that of all artists, his father actually chose a woman who was also well known for inventing little gadgets that helped the people. She was known for her very forward thinking as well, and refusal to conform to the formalities of the world. Mei was just what the castle needed to get a head start in relinquishing the old ways, and hopefully, convince his father to not marry off his son to a woman he and everyone else did not want him to marry. Completely elated, Shuto grabbed Mei's shoulders and shook her slightly before exclaiming, "Miss, you are the founder of forward thinking, and my father is the king of backward." He shook her slightly again before continuing, "Can you talk him into the current century?" "Ugh, Captain Izu, do translate," asked the thoroughly confused Mei as Shuto finally released his hold on her. "Prince Shuto suffers from an arranged marriage, milady." Izuku trailed off, glancing at the prince in amusement before saying, "Among other things." This made Mei guffaw, and the makeshift group began to gather her art and inventions to begin the trip back to the castle, but there was one more place to stop before Shuto was forced to return to his large prison. The manor where he stole the horse from. The sun was slowly rising in the east, and with the sound of a rooster crow, Reader began to stir from her fitful slumber. She noticed that her bed was harder than it normally was, and as she sat up she discovered that she had fallen asleep laying on the floor next to the fireplace again. Her favorite book, Utopia, slid to her lap as she examined her clothes in interest and noticed she was once again covered in soot. Her hands and, she assumed, her face were stained with splotches of ashes here and there. She was sure to get scolded by Nemuri once again today for being a mess, but at least it gave the woman a reason to talk to Reader, even if it was to tell her she was a sorry sight to behold. However, Reader did not have time to sit and examine her person. She had many chores to do in the morning, and worrying about what her stepmother thought about her was not one of them. She always started the day off feeding the pigs. They were given potatoes that did not pass the Baroness's standards. Reader felt bad feeding the animals mediocre food, but she could only give what she was given. Being one of the few servants left to take care of this manor was a large burden to bear. It was also incredibly difficult to watch her father's hard work slowly dwindle into nothing. Reader wished she could be more vocal about her manor situation, but, alas, she was merely a servant now and had no right to argue with her stepmother. If she did, she would be whipped, and she would rather stay silent and unscathed than have to gain new scars for speaking her mind. Or worse, she could be like her dear friend, Ijiro, and be sent overseas to a country where he could never see his friends and family again. This was a cruel world, and one of the sweetest people got the shortest end of the stick. Mina, Ijiro's wife and another servant here at the manor, was very distraught about the whole situation. She hid it well, of course, but reader could tell she missed him dearly. As far as the servants heard, they were to send out the thieves this afternoon. When Mina heard this news, she buried herself in her work, but at night you could hear her crying quietly from her chambers. Yes, it was a cruel world indeed, and what's worse is that Ijiro never did anything wrong. He was being sent away because Namuri had gotten buried in debt and sold him to pay it off. Because of this, Mina and Tsuyut, the other remaining servants, were on constant edge. Not knowing when it would be their time to be sent away and treated like the garbage they were made to believe they were. As Reader finished feeding the pigs, she began to gather hay for the horses and fill their water trough. Sparing a few minutes, she patted and soothed her father's old horse, Buttercup. The horse always made her think of her father, and it made her miss him dearly. The horse was now fairly old, but it still had spirit, and that always brought a smile to Reader's face. Buttercup nuzzled into her hand when she patted its snout. Reader started to giggle when the horse nibbled at her hand. "I'll go collect apples after this and sneak you some," she whispered conspiratorially to the horse. "I know how much you love apples, Buttercup." After finishing off in the stables, Reader began to make her way to the orchard that resided just down the hill from the manor. She didn't bother to grab a basket and decided she would just use her apron's large pockets to hold the apples she gathered. It's something less to carry, and if she got soot on the apples it was not a big deal because she planned on cleaning them anyways. Could not give a dirty apple to Buttercup, after all. Buttercup deserved all the cleanest and ripest apples. Once Reader made it to the field, she got on her knees and began to sift through the many apples to find the least bruised ones. She had a hefty haul already when the sound of horses rushed closer on the road. Turning to the sound of the galloping, Reader saw a group of royal guards making their way past. This was strange because the royal guard was hardly ever seen out here so far in the country. The villagers may have caught a glimpse of a royal traveling carriage once and a blue moon, but nothing this exciting ever happened out here. And it seemed as if they were in a rush as well. This made the young woman wonder if the rumors of the prince were true and if he had run off again. But for him to be out here was near impossible. When the royal guard was out of sight again, Reader went back to gathering apples. When she felt satisfied with the amount she found, she began to make her way back to the manor. She just needed to stop at the well to rinse the apples, take a couple to Buttercup, and then make her way inside to help serve breakfast to the Baroness and her daughters. Reader was almost halfway up the hill when she heard the sound of a lone horse and the deep voice of what sounded like a very aggravated rider. Reader turned her head to the left where the sound was coming from and immediately froze in place. She saw a man covered in a cloak with its hood up hiding his face from her view, but that was not what made her pause. The Dmed thief was stealing her father's horse. In 1 second she went from complete shock to complete anger. With a burst she grabbed an apple from her apron and ran towards the man. She stopped after a few feet, set her feet shoulder-length apart and bent her knees slightly. Reader wound her arm back, making the perfect throwing form, and aimed right for his head. After following through with her throw she heard a thunk and watched as the a-hole fell off her father's horse ungracefully that almost made her stop and laugh. Reader waited a few seconds and pulled out another apple as he tried to keep hiding his face from her as he stood up. With anger she began to throw even more apples as his back was turned towards her. "You thief! How dare you try and steal my father's horse?" she yelled as she threw as many apples at him as she could. He deserved more punishment than just being pelted with apples, but this is all she had on her, so it will just have to do. It was almost comical watching the man try to turn to face her with the amount of apples being thrown at him. "Please, Miss Dash," he was interrupted from an apple that Reader threw right in the middle of his forehead. She watched as he tried to hide his face more with the cloak's hood before he tried to continue to explain this absolutely uncalled for situation. "Miss, please, I needed to dash whack this thunk my horse. It shoe dash whack thunk." This particular apple hit where Reader had not planned on aiming, but it made him double over in pain, so this brought joy to Reader nevertheless. He deserved to feel pain for trying to steal something of her father's and that she cared for deeply. So, when he doubled over from being hit where the sun did not shine, Reader ran to his back and threw another apple at it, making him jump forwards, almost falling on his face. "Miss, I had no choice." This made Reader scoff. The audacity of this man, She angrily thought, who does he think he is? The Afandi king? And what? Our choice is to just let you. I don't think so, sir. With even more power she threw another apple at him to hopefully beat the sense that he sounded absolutely and utterly stupid into him. I was just borrowing it, he countered. This made Rita roll her eyes exaggeratedly. Of all the excuses to give, he had to say he was borrowing it? Did he really think she was that dumb? Obviously, if someone is stealing a horse it means they plan to travel somewhere and had no intention of returning. This man must have been privileged before becoming a thief. Leave now or I'll wake the house, she warned, hoping it would scare him enough to leave without Buttercup. At this moment the man became very still, as if what she said caused him to realize something. This made Reader lower the current apple she was planning to throw at him and watched as he seemed to internally contemplate a matter of importance. After a couple of minutes the man all of a sudden decided to reveal his face and turned towards Reader. When his face came into view Reader's heart sank. Everyone knew of the prince and his strange appearance. Her stepsister, Cammy, constantly talked about how hauntingly appealing the prince was, but to see him in person was a whole other story. Prince Shudo was very handsome even with the large burn scar and the look of plain irritation on his face. His hair was two different colors that split down the middle. The right side was white and the left red, and to match his strange hair, his right eye was a soothing gray, while his left eye was a bright turquoise. He's a walking FANG masterpiece, Reader mentally combusted. Then the realization slowly sunk in and she knew she was screwed. She just pelted the crowned prince with an ungodly amount of apples, and if she could dig a hole, get in it, and die of embarrassment and fear, she would. As soon as she realized he was the prince, she slammed her body to the ground, kneeling before him in fear. She really hoped he was not like his father and chose to show her compassion and not kill her. She was only 18, she did not want to die. Please forgive me, your highness, she said as she placed her dirty hands on the ground in front of her. I did not see you. Okay, that might have been dumb to say. Obviously you saw him, dumb. As she thought this she mentally wondered why her internal monologue started to sound like her best friend, Katsuki. Your aim would suggest otherwise. Reader cringed and took a large, dry gulp before saying, and for that, I know I must die. She was looking at the ground, so she only sensed that this statement made the prince stop in his tracks. The air around you too changed slightly, and you felt guilt radiating off of him now instead of the anger from before. There is no need for that, he sighed. All I ask is that you speak of this to no one and I'll let you go on with your life. This made Reader look up at him in shock while still kneeling. He just looked back at her with a stoic expression that did not give away what he was thinking. Reader took the last few moments she had to observe him. His eyes were really pretty, and it was hard to decide which one to look at. It was almost intimidating being in his presence. It was truly hard to believe that someone like him existed in this world. Even though Reader did have a friend whose skin was literally pink, he still outshined her. Still worrying about her father's horse, however, she tried to build up confidence before saying, "We have other horses, your highness. Younger ones and more agile. If that is your wish." She watched as he mounted the horse and then started to untie a pouch from his belt. Reader's curiosity took over as she wondered what the hell he was doing and what could possibly be in the pouch. Did he end up changing his mind and decide to poison her with something in there? My wish is to be free of my gilded cage, he stated as he dropped the pouch in front of Reader. She watched as a few gold coins fell out, and her mind started to go haywire over the fact he was paying her for throwing apples at him. For your silence, he said right before he left her kneeling there transfixed with the golden coins and the idea that she could finally help a friend from an unnecessary doom. I said I want 4-minute eggs, not 4 one-minute eggs, and where God's name is our bread? Reader heard Cammy yell as Mina rushed to grab the plate of eggs she had wrongly prepared for the ever-so-wonderful ball of sunshine. Mina returned to the kitchen while Tsuyu began to restart the eggs for Cammy. Reader continued to eavesdrop and take her time cutting the bread as the Baroness cleared her throat preparing to scold her favorite daughter. Cammy, precious, what do I always say to you about tone? A lady of breeding ought never to raise her voice any louder than the gentle hum of a whispering wind, said the other daughter, Ochako. She seemed rather proud of herself to remember one of the many lessons of being a proper lady her mother had taught her throughout the years. The Baroness, however, was anything but impressed. With a roll of her eyes, Nemuri haughtily replied, "Ochako dear, do not speak unless you can improve the silence." Annoyed, Ochako looked down at her food and mindlessly played with her already half-eaten egg. She heard Cammy giggle across the table at her. Ochako was not one much keen for violence, but if there ever came a time where if she was given the opportunity to punch her sister, she would. She might even have Reader join in on the fun. They could even throw a party to celebrate. "I was not shrill, mother," Cammy now sighed as she turned to look at Nemuri with her usual don't-care attitude. "I was resonant. A courtier knows the difference." Nemuri looked at her daughter with a look only mothers could give before saying, "I very much doubt your style of resonance would be permitted in the royal court." At the mention of royalty, Reader stopped listening and finished cutting her bread. She still could not believe that she had actually met the prince less than an hour ago. Granted, she did throw apples at him, but he decided to spare her and even paid her. With a huge pep in her step, she walked back to the manor and ran straight to the kitchen to tell Mina and Sue her plan to use these very coins to set Ijiro free this afternoon when she visited the town for shopping and after visiting Katsuki. Mina had been so overwhelmed with happiness that she hugged Reader close and thanked her for using her own money to save a small servant like her husband. Ever since, Reader has been trying to stay as normal as possible, but her mind was abuzz with planning and excitement. She could not wait to see her friend again and help him come back home. When she finally finished with the bread, she grabbed a platter to place it on with a slab of butter and grabbed the now finished eggs for Cammy. When she entered the dining room, the Baroness was reassuring Cammy that she still had a chance to marry the prince. Reader tried not to pull attention to herself, but as she was making her way towards the door after placing the items, Nemuri grabbed her arm, stopping her from retreating. "Oh dear, Reader," she scolded and made a tea noise to show how disappointed she was in the appearance of her stepdaughter. "You should really take more care of yourself. You must have slept in front of the fireplace again?" Before you could even utter a reply, Cammy cut in, "Oh Cinderella, trying to become one with the ashes again?" She mocked Reader with a tut before continuing, "By the way, why don't you just sleep with the pigs if you insist on smelling like one?" Reader clenched her fists in anger while Nemuri glared at her daughter before scolding her and saying that that was very rude to say. Ochako gave Reader a look of apology, almost as if she was sorry for the fact that she was the sister of Cammy Kiyama. She most likely was apologizing for that very reason. "However, you do show a sense of crudeness," sighed Nemuri as she turned her attention back to Reader. "Please, tell me why you choose to be so careless? What can I do to make you try?" This caught Reader off guard, and the question almost insulted her, but it is not as if she can actually speak her mind to the fullest, but maybe she could try to also convince Nemuri to bring back Ijiro without having to spend the coins. She took a moment and looked her stepmother in the eyes before saying, "I do try, stepmother. I wish to please you. Sometimes I sit on my own and wonder what else I could do, how to act dash." "Oh, calm down, child," Nemuri interrupted Reader with a pleased smirk on her face. This made the blood in Reader's veins boil, but it was for the betterment of her friend, so she must endure. Nemuri released her hold on Reader and waved her hand in dismissal. Reader took a glance at her two stepsisters before clearing her throat and asking, "Perhaps if we brought back Ijiro, I would not offend you so dash." "It is your manner that offends, Reader," she cut off Reader angrily. "Throughout these hard times I have sheltered you and cared for you. All that I ask in return is that you help me here without complaint. Is that such an extraordinary request?" Nemuri's scolding made the Reader feel terrible. It really was very difficult to make this woman care for her. All she wanted was to be acknowledged by the Baroness, but it seemed no matter what Reader did, she always fell short. With a quick and quiet, "Yes, milady," Reader left the room and tried very hard to appear strong, but inside her heart was breaking. She understood now that she had no choice now but to help her friend herself. After lunch, Reader would go to the village, meet with Katsuki, borrow one of his mother's dresses, and go to court to save Ijiro. Suki. Katsuki gave an annoyed glare when Reader yelled the nickname he despised as she ran up to him. He was currently standing at his family's door waiting for her, but acting as if he had not been standing here watching for her to arrive safely. Over the years, Katsuki's anger had toned down, but he was still the potty-mouthed, unapologetically honest best friend that Rita grew to love like a brother she never had. They had grown incredibly close throughout the years, often getting mistaken for a courting couple by other villagers. This made them both nauseous and annoyed, often getting teased by Mitsuki, Katsuki's mother. For F's sake, he huffed with crossed arms as Rita jumped on him and attached to him like a sloth to a tree. With a large smile of content, she gave him a tight squeeze that had Katsuki sigh before relaxing slightly and let her hold on to him. He did not get to see Rita as often as he truly liked because of the Baroness and the tight leash she kept on her. So, when Rita is finally released for a half of a day to herself, he tries to take as much advantage of the time he spends with her as he can. "Get off me or you'll throw my back out, dumb." This made Rita burst into a fit of giggles. Although Katsuki was currently finishing up an apprenticeship under his father to be an artist, he kept himself in immaculate shape, waking up every day before the sun rose to do a workout regime that he swore by. He was more than capable of carrying Rita's weight and liked to brag about that very fact constantly. She saw right through his little scheme. "Save your breath, Suki," Rita sighed contentedly and nuzzled her head into Katsuki's shoulder. This made him roll his eyes at her, but made no move of getting her off of him. "Take my affection, you spiteful gremlin. Hug me like a demon human and I'll think about it." Duh, he grumbled as he freed one of his arms to affectionately pat Rita on the head. This made Rita giggle more, and after a few minutes of the two bantering, she finally released her tight hold from Katsuki. Jumping off his side, she landed back on the ground and took in a deep breath while looking around. Katsuki and his family lived a lot closer to the kingdom than Rita and the Baroness did. The small, but quaint, home was roughly a 10-minute walk from Yuzudafu's main square, Tatooine Square, but for Rita it was at least an hour's journey to Katsuki's. The main reason the Bakugas chose a home so close to town was because Mitsuki was a court seamstress. She got to make the most appealing dresses that Rita has ever seen, and they were all for the women of the castle's court. So, because of that very reason, Masaru gave up on his idea of becoming a countryman and chose to help Mitsuki live her dream of designing and creating gowns fit for royalty. Yes, the trip to see the Bakugas was long and tiring, but at least Rita could enjoy the peaceful scenery. Katsuki would come and visit her if he wanted, but he usually preferred meeting halfway, claiming he would blow up the evil old hag's hair if he saw her. It was no secret that Katsuki did not like Nemuri, but because Rita wanted to stay on her good side and keep the manor safe, Katsuki esik'd it up and decided to trust Rita's decision, even if he thought it was a load of absolute shit. With a few more quips and banter, Katsuki led Rita inside where Mitsuki engulfed her in a tight hug. After another 5 minutes of Mitsuki tooting over Rita's messy state, even though she actually bathed before coming to the Bakugas, she set up the outdoor tea table. Mitsuki and Masaru usually joined the two young adults, but Mitsuki had to finish it. Gown for the Princess Fuyumi, and Masaru was currently working on a large portrait of local scenery. So, it was just tea time for Katsuki and Rita today, which gave her plenty of time to explain her plan fully to him now. No, Rita was not at all surprised by Katsuki's blunt disapproval. He may act like a delinquent, but the man was an absolute goody two-shoes. It was always Rita getting the two in trouble when they were younger. Yes, Katsuki got yelled at for picking fights and swearing like a sailor, but Rita was constantly being scolded for her pranks and elaborate schemes to get whatever she wanted. But no matter how long Katsuki argued with Rita and refused to get pulled into her schemes, he always agreed in the end. "Oh, come on, Katsuki," she whined now, "you will not even be there. All you have to do is help me get ready, and then help me afterwards." "That's not why I said no, dumb," he scoffed and rolled his eyes at Rita. If Katsuki was being honest, he thought the plan was actually pretty good, but it put her in danger. The consequences of her going above her station could be fatal. Of course, Katsuki thought the whole situation was shitty in the first place. Kirishima did not deserve to be sent away for a mistake someone else made, but he did not want Rita putting herself in danger and getting the same or worse punishment. "I don't fing like that you're putting your life on the line. What if you get caught, huh?" You can't run your DMN mouth out of every situation, you know. Reader groaned in annoyance at her friend. She leaned back in her chair heavily while crossing her arms in front of her chest. This was true. There have been many times where Reader could not get out of a situation with just her silver tongue. It especially did not work with Nemuri. Reader has received many slashings from the Baroness for not holding her tongue, and because of this, Reader has lost a lot of confidence when speaking to others. No one wanted to know the opinion of a servant, after all. This always made her miss her father. He always took the time to hear her thoughts, and would always treat her opinions with great interest. Even if she was only 8 years old at the time and all she thought about was how she was going to win against Katsuki that day. Trust me, I have worries as well, but who else is going to go, Reader looked at him with furrowed brows and slight frown. It's not like you or the rest of your family can. You live here, so people will recognize you. Reader sat up straighter, but kept her eye contact with Katsuki before continuing. I am the only one who can save Ijiro right now. No one knows me. I earned the coins, so let me take responsibility to save my friend. Well, earned is not really the right word, but he does not need to know that, thought Reader. Katsuki took his time thinking over Reader's words and re-evaluating her plan again. Yes, many bad things can happen, but if Reader managed to save Kirishima, then Mina would have her husband back, he and Reader will gain back a good friend, and Kirishima will not be sent overseas. The plan, like many Reader has devised, is insane. But Katsuki could not deny that it was their only hope. The last chance to save Kirishima. With his signature conspiratorial smirk, Katsuki said, I'm sure the old hag has an ugly butt dress you can use. Shudo was currently being skirted, along with Hatsum, by the royal guard. The strange party was making their way to the manor where Shudo stole the horse from, and he was secretly hoping to not run into the servant who threw apples at him. Not that he was scared, but mainly because the whole altercation was his fault, and, to be frank, he was embarrassed. He did not tell anyone else what had happened, even when Izuku questioned a particularly large red welt growing in the middle of Shudo's forehead. He gave the vague excuse that he passed an orchard and an apple fell from the sky and hit him. Izuku gave him a look like Shudo was stupid, but did not press further to the prince's relief. Besides the artist talking adamantly about God knows what with Tenya, the journey in the country was rather peaceful. When Shudo was racing to run away earlier, he did not really take the time to view the scenery. He could not help but imagine what it would be like to live far away from civilization, no worries about his duties. Shutting his eyes slowly while tilting his head to the sky, he imagined a small cottage with maybe a cat and dog that would jump on him with excitement every time he was near. Shudo always wanted to try to grow a garden. He vaguely remembered his mother once talking about how she wished she had her own that she could take care of. Make it her own, and it would not be as elaborate and large as the castle's gardens. She always talked about how people grew their own vegetables and fruits, and Shudo had always secretly wanted that as well. Shudo's cottage would have vines growing on the sides, practically taking over the windows, threatening to shatter them if they grew anymore. He briefly pictured a woman, but he always scratched that out. Even if Shudo married, he knew it would not be for love. It would be an obligation. He does not want his dream tainted by an arranged marriage either. It was bad enough he had to deal with that in real life. But Shudo knew that the only way a woman would be with him is if they were forced to. He has always been told he has too many scars, and that not one person can deal with them all. It was his burden to bear, not theirs. With a light tap on Shudo's shoulder, Izuku explained to the prince that they were nearing the manor. Shudo righted himself on his horse, and tried to look like the prince he was supposed to be. He knew he did not have it nearly as bad as others, but sometimes it just felt like the whole world was on his shoulders, weighing him down, slowly crushing him into nothingness. Not even his friends and Fuyumi were able to properly help him through his hardest moments. Shudo wonders if he will ever truly feel like himself. He wonders if there will be a day when he can finally breathe easily without feeling like he just took a breath of water that was drowning him. He wishes his mother were here. After a few more minutes of riding, the party finally entered the courtyard of the manor. At the sight of it, Shudo felt a pang in his chest, and wanted nothing more than to hide as he watched an older woman exit the front door and immediately drop into a curtsy as Shudo and Izuku stopped in front of her. Right before Shudo could speak, he heard a commotion from inside the manor, and then in a rush, two young women sprinted into the courtyard, nearly knocking each other down. He heard Izuku try to hide a giggle as they watched the women fix their skirts and curtsied right next to their mother, who was currently looking as if they murdered someone right in front of her. "Welcome, Your Highness," the older woman said now as she bowed her head respectfully. "What an honor and surprise this is. To what do we owe this great honor?" Shudo awkwardly cleared his throat, earning another look from Izuku before fiddling with his horse's reins and saying, "Thank you, ma'am. We are merely here to return your horse." There was an awkward silence as everyone waited for the prince to elaborate, but when he just looked back at the Baroness, expecting her to understand what was going on, Izuku fought the urge to slam his hand to his forehead at the awkward interaction. "Oh, the Baroness," expressed, looking at the prince with confusion. Was it missing? The two sisters exchanged a look that expressed they too were trying to figure out how to interact with the prince. They had only seen glimpses of him, but this is definitely not what they were expecting of someone so handsome. It seems the rumors of Shudo being socially inept were not just rumors after all. "Yes," he bluntly answered, but with a glance from Izuku, Shudo cleared his throat again before elaborating, I borrowed it earlier." The Baroness's eyebrows raised in surprise. Maybe I should not be allowed to speak, Shudo internally berated himself. "And I'm afraid I might have startled one of your servants as well. With quite a good arm, actually," he thought to himself as he rubbed his forehead where the bump had stopped growing. For some reason the memory now brought a slight smile to his face. As people know, it's not every day a woman throws apples to defend a horse. "She's mute, Your Highness," she excused. It was not the first time she made an excuse for who she assumed was Reader. It is like the young woman was out to constantly embarrass the Baroness to no end. Really, Shudo looked at Nemuri with unhidden astonishment. She seemed to have spoken rather forcefully. Shudo did not miss the way the Baroness cringed. She immediately fixed her expression to that of calm and decorum before saying, "Well, it comes and goes, but, as always, Your Highness is welcome to anything he wishes." "Anything at all?" Nemuri takes a second to curtsy once more, with the two daughters following her lead. "Oh, but where are my manners? I am Baroness Nemuri Kiyama, and may I present my daughters Kami and Ochako Kiyama." The two daughters, who were still curtsying, bowed their heads after being introduced. As soon as Kami's head returned, her eyes dug into that of the prince's, unknowingly making him very uncomfortable, but, to be polite, he merely gave an awkward smile. He then felt Izuku nudge him in the ribs, and when Shudo gave him a look as if to say, "What the F dash?" Izuku nodded his head towards the women and mouthing, "Invite them to an outing." Shudo squinted his eyes and with a huff of annoyance, silently nodded his head before returning his attention back to the women of this manor. He would have gladly received an apple to his head from the servant if it would have prevented him from having to suffer through this meeting. "How would you ladies like to join me for a stroll in Tatooine Square one of these days? If you ever have time, of course." He tried to give a friendly smile, but from the look of mild uncomfort from the Baroness, he assumed he failed. Once again, the Baroness showed off her well-trained propriety and smiled kindly at the prince, answering, "It would be our pleasure, Your Highness." With a stiflingly awkward farewell, the prince and his party finally made their way back to the kingdom. All Shudo felt was dread and mild annoyance for the inconvenience of having to host people around the square, but it was the least he could do to apologize for stealing a horse. Maybe someday he could apologize to the servant girl, and this time she would not have apples on her person. Rita was currently making her way through the castle's entrance gates. She was trying her hardest not to show the people of the court that she was incredibly nervous. It did not help that the sunny summer day had brought them all out into the courtyard and gardens, walking around aimlessly and gossiping about whatever people of the court gossip about. She could feel her hands sweating from nerves. Fighting the urge to vomit, she looked around, trying to spot any sign of her friend Ijiro. Katsuki had been right that his mother had a dress she could use, but it was far from ugly. It was a small project that Mitsuki had been working on the side of her many other projects for the courtiers. She had planned on using it personally, but she had been more than willing to give it to Reader. How Rita was going to hide this new dress from her stepmother was an issue she must figure out later. Even though she felt she did not deserve such a gift, she could not help but feel a large amount of warmth when Mitsuki insisted that she keep it. Other than her mother's wedding dress that she inherited, this dress is now one of the prettiest dresses she has ever owned. The color of the dress was a pale gold that shined in the summer sun, and the fabric was a soft satin that made Rita walk with care, afraid she would ruin it. It was high-waisted, the stomacher was a baby blue with pale gold flowers embroidered throughout. The sleeves were puffy with the same gold fabric cuffs placed variously on the arms. The skirt was long and wide. It made her feel a whole lot richer than she would ever be in her entire life, and it made her feel like a small child playing dress-up with Katsuki. This time she was playing the role of a well-groomed courtier woman and not a bloodthirsty pirate. Mitsuki had a pair of shoes that went with the dress, but unfortunately Rita's and Mitsuki's feet were very different in sizes and they did not fit her. So, Rita was stuck with her overworn, servant boots that if someone saw them would know they did not belong on a courtier's feet. This small detail is what is causing Rita to second-guess herself now as she is trying to nonchalantly look for Ijiro while attempting to play the role of a countess. It felt like her heart was in her throat, but she has made it this far and refused to back down now. No one will be looking at your FNG shoes, Katsuki had kindly reassured her earlier when she had voiced this concern to him. Just act like you know what the hell you're doing, and then it's easy, dumbass. Rita was very lucky that Katsuki was terrible with words, or else that would not have motivated her enough to step foot out of the Bakuga's house. After a few more minutes of searching, she finally spotted Ijiro getting pushed into a carriage made for criminals. It was pretty much a cage on wheels, and it was practically filled to the brim. The sight of her friend made her heart leap, and without thinking she began to run to where the coachman was locking up the cage in aggravation. Seeing Ijiro being treated in such a way made Rita completely forget about the anxiety she was feeling earlier, and the stares she received from the people around her went right over her head. All she could think of was getting there before the man took away her friend to the boats. "Excuse me, sir," Rita yelled with a lot more confidence than she ever thought she was capable of when she reached the coachman right as he was ushering the horses to move. "I wish to address the charges of this man." She pointed at Ijiro, who looked completely stunned to see her, before continuing, "He is my servant and I wish to pay the debt made against him." The rather rude coachman scoffed at her and spat, "Too late, he's already paid for." This made Rita gulp, but forced herself to breathe. At this point many people were surrounding them and watching the interaction. She had not planned on making a scene, but she still had her bargaining chip. "Please, I can pay 50 gold coins." This was all she had in the pouch, and Rita knew it was more than enough to free her friend. There was no possible way that the man could deny that. "Sweetheart, you could have me for 50 gold coins." He scoffed once again, and forced his horses to the side to try and go around Rita. This made Rita's face inflame. Was this really how he treated other courtiers? Or was it because it was her? Did no one speak up for others here? With clenched teeth, and a very shortened patience, Rita seethed, "I demand you release him, or I'll take the matter to the king." Rita, of course, had no intention of going to the dreaded King Enji, but at this point she was talking out of her butt. She had to do whatever she could to get Ijiro released. The coachman rolled his eyes in annoyance before talking down to her once again. "The king is the one who sold him. He is to be sent overseas, property of Cartier." At this point Rita said, "Held to propriety," and with the darkest glare to ever be seen on a woman's face she growled, "He is not property at all, you ill-mannered tub of guts." Not releasing her glare, she took a deep breath before continuing, "Do you think it right to chain people up like chattel? I demand you to release him at once." "Get out of my way," the insulted man yelled right back in her face. Before Rita could even spout the word "but," and other various obscenities she learned from Katsuki, a very familiar and low voice echoed through the courtyard behind Rita. "You dare raise your voice at a lady, sir?" "Sheet," she winced, looking to the ground as if he had been scolding her. This was not the time for him to show up. What if he recognized her? She would be a goner. Ijiro would be sent away and her effort would be for nothing. However, she made it this far. She just needs to stay confident. She was very dirty earlier, she looked like a different person now, so he most likely would not remember her. As Reader slowly turned to face the prince, the coachman awkwardly cleared his throat before saying, "Your Highness, forgive me, sire." When she finally faced the prince, she bowed in respect, trying to fight the urge to vomit once again, and also trying to calm the increasing beat of her heart when Prince Shudo's eyes met hers for a split second before he turned his attention back to the coachman. "I swear I meant no disrespect." He began to plead his case, making Reader try very hard to not roll her eyes. "I was just following orders. It's my job to take thieves to the boats." Unable to hold her tongue any longer, Reader bit, "A servant is not a thief, Your Highness. And those who are cannot help themselves." There was no way she was going to stand and hear people call her innocent friend a thief. This world was corrupt, and the way her people are treated never sat right with her. She could thank the book Utopia and her father for teaching her that. Really, the prince looked almost amused when he and Reader met each other's eyes once more. "Well, then. By all means, enlighten us." He waved his arm in front of him as if to say, "Perform a play right here." Izuku looked at the prince with a strange look, but Reader's chest warmed at the chance to finally explain her views. Even if she never would have been given this chance dressed as a servant, she could take advantage of the moment and make her point clear. With a deep breath, a glance at Ijiro, and a small smile, Reader quoted, "If you suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners corrupted from infancy, then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them. What else is to be concluded, sire, but that you first make thieves and then punish them?" Much to everyone's surprise, the prince smirked. With a wave of dismissal towards the coachman he said, "Well, there you have it. Release him." The coachman, who was completely floored, tried to protest, but, "Sire dash," I said. The prince interrupted with mild annoyance, "Release him?" "Yes, sire." With the widest smile, Reader followed after the coachman as he went to the cage to unlock it and pull Ijiro from the large group of men. Once his hands were unbound, Reader hugged him quickly and practically threw the pouch of coins at the coachman. He took it with a gruff, but continued closing the cage and leaving with the other supposed criminals. Ijiro was practically jumping up and down, and Reader placed her hands on his forearms to try to get him to calm down as she laughed happily. She leaned close to him and whispered, "Meet Katsuki at the bridge, I'll be there soon." Ijiro gave her an enthusiastic nod, and forced himself from running to where she told him to meet her. He could not wait to see everyone again. He was finally a free man once again. With a smile still plastered on her face, Reader turned back to the prince and walked up to him. She gave a small curtsy and said, "Thank you so much for your help, Your Highness." And with her gratitude displayed, she began to make her way towards the gates, thinking this would be the last time she saw the strange prince. However, the ever-curious man was not done with her yet. So, he hopped off his horse and chased after her. "Miss," he yelled to get her attention. He did not expect her to quicken her pace, but he continued anyway, "Have we met?" She did seem awfully familiar, but he cannot, for the life of him, remember where he could have possibly met someone so intriguing. A woman who had a strong opinion was rare to come by, so he was sure he would have remembered someone like her if he had met her before. Reader awkwardly cleared her throat and tried to keep her face forward, so he could not look at her directly. "I do not believe so, Your Highness. I could have sworn I knew every courtier in the kingdom." He trailed off. It was a little irritating that he recognized her from somewhere, but could not remember when or where. Well, she tried to think of a believable lie on the spot. She had not thought that anyone, much less the prince, would show any interest in her. Maybe it was because she was a courtier? She used to being ignored as a servant, after all. "Well, I'm visiting a cousin." "Yes, that is good. Believable. Lots of people visit from other villages and kingdoms to see family." "Ooh. Sheet," she mentally cursed. This is not what she wanted to end the day on. Why was Prince Shudo so interested? Did he not have anything better to do? Like sleazy women? UH.my cousin. She cringed while the prince let out a breath in amusement. "Yes, you said that. Which one? How about you leave me alone, and you'll never find out?" He was just as infuriating as this morning. Was he always this persistent, Or was he just brought to this world to give reader hell? The only one I have, sire, she answered, trying to hide her annoyance as he pushed forward, stopping in front of her, and forcing her to look at him. He observed her features for a moment with interest. Reader tried to not meet his gaze, but once again she could not resist his appealing eyes that pulled her in. He was too handsome for his own good. With a smirk he said, "Are you coy on purpose, or do you honestly refuse to tell me your name?" Reader tried to ignore the racing of her heart as his smile broke across his face. Yes, way too handsome for his own good, Reader thought as she fought to keep down the blush that was growing on her face. No and yes, she answered honestly as she tried to make another getaway, but once again he stuck by her side. He was resilient, she would give him that. Then, give me your cousin's name, so I can call upon her to learn who you are, he suggested before complimenting. Anyone who quotes Thomas More is well worth the effort. Shudo could not hold back his large smile when Reader stopped in her tracks and turned to him with surprise and excitement. The prince has read Utopia? With another smirk he thought, caught you? I found it sentimental and dull. She gave him a look that said she was anything but impressed, so he continued, I confess, the plight of the everyday rustic bores me. I take it you do not converse with many peasants, she blandly observed with the same unimpressed glare. This just made the prince laugh quietly. Certainly not. Naturally. With a disappointed hum, Reader scolded, Excuse me, sire, but there is nothing natural about it. She turned on her heel, but as she predicted the prince followed after her as she continued her lesson. A country's character is defined by its everyday rustics, as you call them. They are the legs you stand on. That position demands respect, not dash. Am I to understand, he interrupted, that you find me arrogant? Stopping once again, the young woman turned to Shudo and said, Well, you gave one man back his life, but did you even glance at the others? Shudo felt his chest burst with her words. He has never met someone who felt so strongly about something. How this woman could fit all this passion in a smaller body was beyond his comprehension. All he knew is that he needed to know who she was, and wanted to see her again. Please, I beg you, he pleaded, surprising Reader, a name. Any name? Even though Reader indeed thought that the prince was arrogant, it was rather fun talking to him. She also assumed this was the last she was ever going to see him again, so it would not hurt to give him something, she supposed. I fear the only name I can leave you with is Countess Emi Fukukado, she said with a fond smile. Not realizing that the act made the prince giddy with excitement. He had something to go on now, right? A call of his name came from a distance, and when they both turned they saw it was Princess Fuyumi greeting her brother back home. Not surprised in the slightest that he ran away again, and was brought back home on the same day. With the distraction, Reader bolted through the gates, leaving the prince to wonder where the hell she went, and when he was going to see her again. When Reader was finally free of the prince, she practically skipped to the bridge to meet Katsuki and Eijiro. She could not believe her plan had actually worked. Even if it did not go as expected, or at all as she expected, she still managed to save Eijiro from being shipped overseas. She may have been mildly annoyed by the prince, but he surprised her once again by helping her with the rude coachman. It was also interesting to see how he interacted with her as a courtier as opposed to a servant earlier this morning. She was very lucky that he did not recognize her. Now Reader just had to worry about changing back into her servant attire and make up an excuse to give Nemuri when she asked about Eijiro's sudden return. Oi, dummus, what the F took so long? Bakugu, language. Reader was pulled from her thoughts at Katsuki's yell and Eijiro's familiar, light-hearted scolding. Her two friends were up ahead waiting at one of the 3 bridges that separated the kingdom of Mizudafu from the country surrounding it. It was the oldest bridge, and hardly anyone came down here. It was perfect for Reader to meet her friends secretly and change into her servant clothes in the woods nearby. It was also Katsuki's favorite spot to paint in the summer. He liked the peaceful sounds of the river and, because he hated most people, he did not have to worry about being bothered. Rather deal with bird shit than listen to another old hag talk about the shitty weather. He would always complain to Reader whenever she would get the chance to meet him. There was only one thing she heard Katsuki complain more about than an old childhood friend she never met, and that was his complete disdain for small talk. God forbid if reader ever asked how his day was, or if he was awake during a thunderstorm from the night before. If it did not instill a meaningful conversation, Katsuki did not want to listen. And if anyone tried small talk, he would growl like a feral dog, turn on his heels, and walk briskly away from them. "Shut the F up, shitty hair," Katsuki yelled in Ijiro's ear, his face contorting into fury and annoyance as opposed to his normal relaxed, furrowed brows and scowl. Katsuki was wearing an off-white peasant shirt covered by a burnt orange vest and black trousers. Reader could tell it was an outfit his mother most likely made for him, and also most likely made him wear before leaving the house. He wore it haphazardly, but that seemed to work in his advantage, giving him a handsome, rugged style that women swooned for. In contrast, Ijiro was still wearing the clothing he wore when he was taken away, a dirty peasant shirt that used to be stark white and splotched dark brown trousers that hung on him loosely. His greasy hair was pulled back in a bun and his eyes had dark circles underneath. His appearance made Reader's heart clench. Ijiro just smiled and sighed, turning his head to watch Reader approach. Much to Katsuki's annoyance, Ijiro was never bothered by his short temper. No matter how many times Katsuki yelled at him, Ijiro always kept a smile on his face. It helped that he was in an extra good mood today, and his smile was far more dazzling than it usually is. "Sorry, got held up," Reader explained when she finally met her two friends by the bridge's entrance. This made Katsuki huff and roll his eyes at her, but before she could be reprimanded and interrogated, Reader continued, "Prince Todoroki would not leave me alone after he helped me save EI. Huh?" By Katsuki's reaction, Reader could only assume that Ijiro had yet to explain what exactly happened. This made Reader sigh because the very reason she stayed quiet about running into the prince this morning is Katsuki's connection with the royal family and, of course, her payment for silence. He had met the prince many times through his mother, and for some reason despised him. Reader always assumed it was because the king was very well known as being an egotistical a-hole, but Katsuki's disdain for Prince Shudo was different. Like it was almost a competition. He often referred to him as half and half in conversations. Like many of his nicknames, it made Reader wrinkle her nose because it was just plain mean. Reader, for a long time, assumed it was because of jousting competitions Katsuki would sometimes take part in if it was open to the public, but he has never lost to the prince. However, Katsuki always complained that Prince Shudo never tried hard enough, and thus made the win null in his mind. See, Reader was naturally competitive as well, but when it came to Katsuki she did not come close. After all, Katsuki was a perfectionist and wanted to be the best at everything. If one tiny detail does not go his way, he throws a fit. It was an absolute miracle to Reader that he ever got any work done. Reader stopped right in front of her two friends and let out an exasperated sigh at Katsuki's reaction. She crossed her arms and leaned on her right hip, and this made Katsuki roll his eyes and cross his own arms, prepared to fight with words if she decided to be sassy. After knowing each other since BR, it was very easy to read each other, and Katsuki just knew that Reader was going to give him attitude. Or, worse, withhold information from him about the prince and a story he knew was much longer than the half-butted excuse Reader gave him this morning. He knew Reader would never steal, but how the hell else would she get all those gold coins? "Look here, Brett. You better start from the beginning," he growled, trying to intimidate someone who knows him too well does not really work, but Katsuki could not help it, and not just how you got EI free, but how the hell you got all those gold coins. "Fine," sighed Reader. She began with the morning how she was picking apples and caught the prince trying to steal Buttercup. This made Katsuki growl again, but he let her continue telling the events of her day, how she promised to keep it a secret that she saw Prince Shudo and how he paid her to keep silent. Ijiro and Katsuki's eyes widened at that, but now it explained why Reader did not even tell Katsuki how she had earned those coins. After she ended with how Prince Shudo was the main reason Ijiro was free now, the three friends stood silently looking at each other as the information sunk in. Of course the FING half and half BSRD wouldn't pay attention to your face. Selfish a-hole. Doesn't understand that servants are FNG people too. Reader did not take offense to the prince not remembering her, but Katsuki made it sound like a crime. His crossed arms had tightened and he looked positively livid. It's not like you're a swamp monster, for F's sake. Suki, if this is your way of telling me that I'm not ugly, you need to work on your compliments. Shut the F up, I wasn't complimenting you. Meanwhile, Shudo was currently being scolded by the one person in the world he wished would burst into flames. His sorry excuse of a father, King Enji Todoroki. Shudo trained his ears to drown out whatever the man yelled at him about. In a way, people would consider it a blessing that the king did not use his fists to enforce discipline to his children and wife any longer, but Shudo used this as an advantage. At least with words, Shudo had the choice to ignore the king. When he was young, weak, and vulnerable, he did not have the ability to defend himself. But now he was older and stronger, and had the ability to fight the king if he needed to. It never came to that, but it gave him self-assurance. He also could not stop thinking about the events that transpired today. The servant who threw apples at him and kept his secret. Then he met the artist, Hatsum, who was just as eccentric and strange as he's heard. And how could he forget the woman who stood to defend a mere servant who was being sent overseas? Her face kept popping into his head, and it brought a warmth to his chest, something he has never felt before. All he wanted was to see her again, and he hoped that Fuyumi knew who she was and could help him. Emi Fukukaru, he thought to himself, Emi, such a pretty name for someone just as appealing and strong-willed. He really wanted to see her again. Shudo, get your head out of your butt, and listen to your superior. Shudo scowled at his father and growled, funny, I don't see a worthy superior nearby. King Enji slammed his fists on his desk in retaliation. They were seated in the royal study, and Enji had been yelling at his son for nearly half an hour now, but Shudo still refused to listen. It seemed only Fuyumi was paying any attention to the father, and even she was getting annoyed with Shudo's attitude at this point. She understood that Shudo did not want to be king, but with Tuya's death and then Natsuo's complete refusal to take the throne, Shudo was the only one who could follow in their father's footsteps. If Fuyumi had the choice to take the throne, she would save Shudo from the responsibility. Does that mean she wished to be queen? No, but in order to save Shudo, she would have taken the crown for him. Clearing her throat to gain both of her angered family members' attention, she calmly said, Shudo, I understand you do not wish to be king and marry a woman you do not know, but you need to understand that you were born to privilege, and with that comes specific obligations. Shudo crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair at his sister's statement. He did not ask to be born, and DMN his father for wanting the perfect child to take the throne and forced his mother into marriage and have children with him. It was not fair that his whole life was planned for him, and now he had to just go along and get married to a woman he did not even know. Specific obligations my butt, he internally seethed. I have no interest in combining the Yaoyorozu kingdom and ours. We never went to war with them, so why should the union matter so much? Shudo, Enji sighed as he tried to calm his anger for his disobedient son. The union is to bring our kingdoms together and gain a larger army. It's to prevent them ever dreaming of wanting to go to war with us. Plus, they do not have a prince to marry off Fuyumi to. Only a princess around your age. Shudo felt anger continue to boil in his limbs at the thought of Fuyumi also being used for the gain in politics between kingdoms. At least, so far, she was protected from having to be married off. He should feel lucky that he, at least, had some advantage to be open with his thoughts, while she had no choice but to sit and listen only for the fact that she was a woman. This world could truly be cruel. I refuse to marry her, he huffed as he stood up and motioned Fuyumi to follow him out. When she was standing beside him at the door, he turned back to his father, who looked like his veins popping from his head and neck were about to burst, and said, I don't care if it's my obligation. You're the king. Figure something else out, damn it. I don't wish to be used as a pawn to your advantage any longer. I don't want to break like you made mother. And with that, he left with Fuyumi following behind with an apologetic smile. Yai. Seeing the wide smile on Mina's face as she saw Ijiro and Reader walking up the path that led to the manor made Tsuyu's eyes well with tears. It has been so long since Mina has looked so happy, and it made Tsuyu's chest warm seeing Reader bring back the friend that when he left felt like he took the sun with him. It was blinding being on the receiving end of both of their smiles as they ran into each other's arms. Tsuyu and Reader watched on as Mina and Ijiro embraced each other tightly, as if they would be ripped from the other again if they released for even a second. After changing back into her servant dress and hiding her gifted dress in a borrowed satchel from Katsuki, Reader and Eijiro parted ways at the bridge from him. The walk back home was filled with chatter between Reader and Eijiro. He wanted to know about everything he had missed, and kept asking about Mina and how she was doing. Reader could not help her own smile from growing as she watched her two friends reunite. The day the two newlyweds were separated was one of the hardest days of Reader's life. She had never seen Mina cry so much, and the look of utter pain and betrayal on Eijiro's face was too much to bear. Eijiro had every right to feel betrayed after all. He had been working for years at the manor. If the Baroness had not spent all her money on silly things, then Eijiro would not have been sold, and he would have not become a SLV and almost sent to a completely different country. Just because he was a servant, it did not mean he should be punished for the wrongdoing of his employer. If he did not love the manor, Reader, and Tsuyu, or Mina as much as he did, he would have left 10 years ago after Aizawa passed. Namuri turned out to be a cunning, cruel woman, and the only human Eijiro truly despised. It hurt his heart to see Reader fight for even a sliver of the woman's affection, but at this point he believed that the Baroness had absolutely no interest in opening her heart to the young Aiz. And for that very reason, Eijiro stayed for his friends, and to make sure that Reader received the love and friendship everyone deserves. Even though Mina, Tsuyu, and Eijiro could not give her the parental affection she craved, they at least could show her that they were there for her. At this point, Mina and Eijiro were practically bathing each other in kisses and I love yous, almost making Reader and Tsuyu uncomfortable. Once the two finally broke apart, Tsuyu rushed to give Eijiro a bone-crushing hug. He laughed as he hugged her back, more tears of joy falling down his cheeks. Reader heard Tsuyu whisper a welcome back as she pulled back. Her lips were trembling, but her eyes were lit up as she looked at her close friend, practically committing his kind face to memory in fear he might be taken away again. A few more minutes Mina spent complaining about Eijiro's appearance and how they needed to get him cleaned as soon as possible. The Baroness would surely complain if she were to find dirt in the manor due to his messy state. Reader watched as Mina practically began to drag Eijiro to the servants' quarters, and excitedly explain how she saved enough coins to purchase a new bar of soap that smelled of lavender and thyme. Tsuyu was right behind them, adding how she could get the bath ready for him and even make some tea to calm his most likely tired mind. That made Mina jump up and down with excitement, now claiming they should celebrate his return tonight after feeding the emissaries and her daughters. Welcome home, soothed Reader as she walked behind her friends as they slowly made their way to the manor, talking excitedly. Somebody's in trouble, sang Kami when Reader entered the manor after dropping off Katsuki's satchel in her room. Kami and Ochako were spending their afternoon in the game room where they were fighting boredom playing chess. Ochako did not care much for the game, but Kami always claimed it made people smarter, and only the smartest women get husbands. Ochako was not stupid, but Kami talked to her as if she was, which irritated the brunette immensely. Chess was a boring game anyway. She would file for divorce if her future husband only wanted to play chess. What do you mean? Reader nervously nibbled at her bottom lip from Kami's teasing as she replaced a vase of flowers with some daisies she found outside on the hill. As far as she knows, Namuri had yet to know Eijiro had returned, and she made sure to have finished all of her chores before leaving to visit Katsuki today. Reader was almost positive that she had done nothing to upset Namuri, but with the Baroness, the Reader could breathe the wrong way and she would be scolded. You stupid, stupid girl. Reader quickly turned to find her stepmother right behind her with hands on her hips, furrowed brows, and a large frown. It was almost like the two planned this, and Namuri was just waiting for Reader to get home. How could you do this to me? To Kami? It's embarrassing and utterly disgraceful. Have you no shame? To say Reader was confused was an understatement. She tried to stay calm and not flinch from her stepmother's glare as she timidly asked, "What did I do?" Namuri let out a loud scoff as she crossed her arms and turned to share a look with Kami. This made Reader wring her hands around the old flowers, effectively crushing them with her palms. Out of nerves, she kept nibbling on her bottom lip as her eyes flitted between Namuri and Kami. If Reader knew what she had done wrong, she would have been able to pretend confidence, But the unknown was eating her alive and she really did not like it when Nemuri was upset with her. Cammie's eyes closed to a slit and her mouth curved into a smirk. In the same cruel, teasing tone she said, "Think, reader. Think really hard." Out of desperation, reader looked to Ochako, who now took it upon herself to use charades to help the young servant figure out what she did wrong. Reader watched Ochako mimic galloping and mouthed words like, "horse" and "prince." Reader furrowed her brows as she thought and realized they were referring to this morning when the prince had stolen the horse. She decided to tread carefully. She was still unsure if they knew the full extent of the story. However, she was secretly hoping the prince was nice enough not to mention her throwing apples at him. "Prince Shudo stole our horse this morning?" Reader spoke barely above a whisper. Nemuri rolled her eyes at Reader and sighed heavily as if this very incident was the reason for all her problems. "Yes, and that would explain why he returned it this afternoon." Nemuri spoke to Reader as if she was the most stupid girl in the world. It made Reader's heart fall, but she merely gulped and looked to the floor to hide her embarrassment. "How dare you let him surprise us like that?" "I'm sorry." "Oh, not to worry." Nemuri's attitude switched in a second to that of a more carefree, teasing nature. "Luckily for you, Cammie put on a wonderful performance. We were invited to an outing with His Highness. Hopefully sometime this week." Reader started to breathe easier as Nemuri smiled fondly at Cammie and Ochako forced herself not to roll her eyes. Reader fought the surge of jealousy of the look her stepmother gave her stepsister, but it was silly to wish Nemuri would ever look at her like that. "Now," Nemuri abruptly stated before turning back to Reader, all traces of fondness gone, "tell me what happened." "He said you were forceful. What did you say?" Shame returned to her as she tried to think of something not as horrible as throwing apples at the prince to tell her stepmother. She continued ringing the flowers when she stuttered, "I called him a thief, ma'am." After Nemuri scoffed again, Reader tried to defend herself, "I did not recognize him." Cammie and Nemuri laughed at Reader as if this was the silliest thing the young servant has ever done. Feeling utterly small and embarrassed, Reader said nothing in defense when Nemuri jabbed, "Oh, Reader, you poor little country girl." She giggled a little more before shaking her finger at Reader and ordering, "Just make sure to take extra care in cleaning. Cannot have the royal bottom sitting on a dirty chair, now can we?" All Reader could do was nod in silence as Ijiro, Mina, and Tsuyu entered the room. They had heard yelling and laughing and wanted to check on Reader. Unfortunately, to their dismay, it seemed they had come too late to morally help Reader through Nemuri's scolding. "What are you doing here?" Cammie's question was asked rather rudely for Reader and Mina's liking, but the young instas was rude to everyone. Ijiro looked around awkwardly as he remembered the excuse Reader and Katsuki made up for him to use. "I worked off my debt." He cringed, almost accusing his empress of her issues with money. "They said I could go home, ma'am." "Oh," exclaimed Nemuri, "well then, go to catch a chicken. Do you know of a Countess Emi Fukukado?" Shudo and Fuyumi were currently taking an evening walk through the gardens. His father was finishing up dinner with Mei Hatsum. Before the dinner, Shudo practically begged the woman to try to talk some sense into his father. The prince knew that Enji had a weak spot for the brilliant artist, so he was hoping that Mei would be able to get the king to see reason and not force his son into an unwanted marriage. Shudo wanted was to make his own decisions, and that included who he wished to marry. Fuyumi hummed as she thought over all the courtiers she was forced to interact with throughout the years, but the name did not ring a bell. She said as much to Shudo now. She felt horrible that she could not help him when she watched his face fall at the news. This was the first time she had seen him show any interest in someone outside their family besides Izuku and Tenya, his only close friends. Not even the notorious, hot-headed artist, Katsuki Bakugu, could pique his interest enough to instill a conversation. Fuyumi could not help but wonder who this mystery girl was that seemed to have captured the attention of her brother. "Why do you ask?" She could not help but let her curiosity be known. Shudo grunted in what Fuyumi considered amusement, but his face stayed neutral, so she could not be sure. He let out a quiet sigh and said, "No reason, that she just said some things that I found intriguing, I guess." "Shudo." King Enji came barreling down the pathway towards his two children. His face was contorted in his usual scowl. The two siblings paused in their walking to watch the king walk up to them silently. Shudo fought the urge to roll his eyes when his father met them and turned his attention to Shudo. "I have made a decision regarding your marriage." His voice boomed throughout the gardens. Shudo's interest was piqued, but he stayed silent as Enji continued. "In 1 week we will be holding a ball for Hatsume's arrival and accomplishments. I will open it to the whole kingdom. By midnight you must have a woman of your choice to marry and you will announce it to the people. However, if you do not have a choice by then I will announce the engagement between you and Princess Momo Yayorozu. Understood?" 1 week was not a long time to find a wife, but for Shudo it was the best opportunity he has ever been given by his father. If he was lucky, he could find the countess by then and maybe even get the chance to court her before the ball. It was like fate was finally on his side, and it was too much of a coincidence that Fukukado had come into his life the moment he was allowed to make his own decision to select his bride. So it was no surprise when Shudo genuinely smiled and answered, "Understood." Right after breakfast, there was a knock on the manor's door. Namuri was currently in the lounge room sitting by the fireplace, staring at the flames as she listened to her two daughters banter in the game room across the house. Once she heard the knocks, she stood and gracefully walked to the door, answering it with a smile that grew once she saw the short, purple-haired, perverted royal page that was wrapped tightly around her finger. Mineta greeted Namuri with a smirk and a good morning as he handed her an envelope that, once she opened it, held an official invitation for the ladies of the house to attend a masked ball being held at the palace this coming Friday. Namuri's mind began racing with the doors that this event opened for her dear Kami, and what she could wear for the occasion. "I also come with a message from His Highness," Mineta now spoke, returning Namuri to the present. She leaned slightly forward to show she was listening to him, even though the act only fueled his perverted thoughts more, but Namuri also knew very much what she was doing. Mineta's smirk widened as he explained, "He wishes to meet you and your daughters for the outing he promised after he is finished with a tennis game he has scheduled with a count." "Oh, how exciting," she gushed as she smiled sweetly at Mineta. "Now is there any news of the engagement?" "Cancelled." Mineta gossiped and leaned closer to Namuri as well. Her alluring facade did not once falter, even if the young man's presence revolted her. She had to do what was best for her daughters, and that included getting all the information as she could about the prince, so Kami could have the chance at becoming queen and live an easy life. Rumor has it, he must find himself a bride before that very night. "Well, that does not give us very much time, now does it?" She worried as she nibbled on her lip and leaned against the door frame as she crossed her arms. Today was Friday, so that gave Kami merely a week to capture the prince's attention and win him over enough to marry her. But Namuri is a determined woman, and luckily for her, she had this little but to get all the information she needed. She reached into her pocket for her coin purse, and with a mischievous and innocent look in her eye, she began placing coins one by one in the royal page's hand as she whispered, "I shall need to know what the competition is, every move he makes, his agenda, and any other tidbits you might pick up." Namuri gave him a wink as he nodded excitedly at her attention. She then decided to take it a step further with her flirting and began to caress his cheek, rubbing her soft thumb along his cheek as she soothed, "Skin with such elegance. Concealing such ruthlessness." She smirked as his eyes went heavy as if the sound of her voice was putting him to sleep. "I have grown very fond of our intrigues together. Surely you must know that." "I'm getting an inkling, my lady," he sighed with lovesick eyes. "When my daughter is queen," she boosted as she stood up straight again, "perhaps we might come to a new arrangement." This, of course, was a lie, but Namuri just smiled as Mineta grinned secretly and made his way back to his horse with a satisfied gait. Reader and Tsuyu were currently cutting out some honeycombs to collect honey in jars. They were both donning large sun hats that were draped in netting to protect their faces, while their hands were covered with large protective gloves. The bees buzzed around the two in irritation as Reader carefully and meticulously used a knife to cut a honeycomb that was fully developed and just glistened beautifully in honey. Even though the sky was overcast this morning, the humid air was warm, and the excitement summer brought was still in the air. Tsuyu was standing to Reader's left, holding a bowl in preparation for the honeycomb Reader was cutting out. Tsuyu's face was relaxed as she watched the bees fly around their heads, and she held a small smile on her face as she looked at Reader fondly. She was still thankful that Reader had saved Aijiro, and last night she had told Mina and her all about her meeting the prince. What made Tsuyu smile wider was the fact that Reader had grown a liking to complain about the prince now. Constantly. Well, Tsuyu breezed now after Reader had once again mentioned something about Prince Shudo. I would have given anything to see you dressed as a courtier, speaking to the prince like a lady. Reader scoffed as she carefully removed the honeycomb from the bee box and placed it on the plate Tsuyu was holding. As she closed the box's cover she corrected, "Scolding him is more like it, and I cannot believe I gave him my mother's name." Reader gave an exasperated sigh as she and Tsuyu began to remove their gloves and hats. Once the netting was out of her face, Reader haughtily concluded, "The man is insufferable." "Yes," bluntly replied Tsuyu, "you've been saying that all morning." "Well, it's as true as it was last night," huffed Reader as she took Tsuyu's gloves and hat for her and stacking them together in a small chest near the bee box. The two young women began walking back towards the manor slowly as they continued their conversation. "Oh well, Reader, he's royalty," chastised Tsuyu, as if this answered every issue Reader had with the prince. "They're born like that." "I suppose the penalty for being wealthy is that you have to live with the rich," joked Reader when they reached the back door and entered the manor. They made their way to the kitchen where Mina was preparing a soup for dinner later that evening. Reader and Tsuyu began splitting the combs into smaller parts so it would be easier to squeeze the honey out. Tsuyu sighed and said, "I'll bet he's charming once you get to know him. Honestly, I think he and Cammy deserve each other." Both Tsuyu and Mina gasped at Reader as if she insulted their very beings. She laughed at their reactions as she lined up the two jars for the honey and began to squeeze a piece of honeycomb over it. "Bite your tongue," Mina scolded, but there was no heat behind her words. "The only throne I want her sitting on is the one I have to clean every day." This made all three women laugh loudly. They continued to joke around as they continued to work on their duties. Sometime after lunch, Reader was filling the wood for the various fireplaces throughout the house. She was currently carrying a bundle to her stepmother's room. As she climbed the stairs, she heard the voices of Nemuri, Cammy, and Ochako. They seemed to be discussing the ball that they had gossiped about over lunch and what Cammy was going to wear. When she entered the room, however, Reader had just missed what Cammy snorted at Ochako and found her holding her mother's wedding gown against her front. "What are you doing?" Reader asked as she stood just inside the doorway looking at Cammy with worry. It was her mother's dress, after all, and if Reader were to ever marry, it was to be her own wedding dress as well. It was the only thing of her mother's that Reader had, and she was worried Cammy was trying to steal it or destroy it. Nemuri sensed Reader's worry and immediately took action. "Airing out your dress for the mask," she lied, but, as always, her voice was laced with honey and it sounded far too convincing. Reader could not help but feel hope flow through her veins. Her eyes widened at her stepmother as she cautiously took a small step, moving farther into the room. Ochako, on the other hand, looked at her mother with disbelief. She was still holding the shoes that matched the dress, and she started to accusingly point one at her mother. "Her dress? But you just said dash." "I suppose for a commoner it would have to do," interrupted Cammy as she slowly handed the dress back to her mother. "I mean, look at it, it's practically an antique." Reader chose to ignore Cammy's insult as she stared at her stepmother with hopeful eyes. She was hoping Nemuri was finally willing to involve Reader into family events, and the ball would be a great break from all the hard work she has been doing to keep the manor standing. She might have secretly hoped the prince would be there and would love the chance to scold him about his ignorant views again. "You wish me to go to the mask?" "Of course." Nemuri flapped her hand at Reader, but her voice sounded strained. She cleared her throat as she forced a kind smile to convince Reader that she was being genuine. "I don't know what to say." "Say, honestly, Reader," laughed Nemuri, "it hurts me to know that you don't feel like one of my daughters." "I only meant dash. I thought we could go as one big happy family." She cut off Reader and hopped slightly on her toes to try to convey a carefree appearance. Reader's brows furrowed, but she was started to get convinced by Nemuri's words. Her stepmother got serious once again as she ordered, "That is, if you complete your chores in time, mind your manners till then." Ochako has had enough of her mother's lying. With a scoff she threw the shoes on the bed and stormed out of the room. Reader watched her go with confusion, as Ochako hardly ever was upset, even with her sister being the way she is. When Reader returned her attention back to Nemuri, she noticed her stepmother's face was full of worry, but Kami only looked annoyed as usual. "What's the matter with her?" Reader asked with concern. Nemuri tried to think of something to say as an excuse, but it was Kami who answered. Her face morphed into pity as she looked at Reader, and pouted her lips. "Oh, she doesn't want you to go. Do you really think there is only one perfect mate?" Shudo thought aloud as he tossed yet another thin rock at the lake. He watched silently as it bounced a few times before it plopped once more and sunk into the water. The water was perfectly still today, there was hardly a breath of wind. The sky was still covered with clouds, but in some areas it began to separate, letting the afternoon light peek through. It was beginning to warm up as well, the humidity dissipating slightly along with the clouds. May was currently working on a few finishing touches on one of her latest baby's inventions. From what Shudo saw earlier, after catching a glimpse of it before distracting himself with rock skipping, it appeared to be two small boats. What May had in mind, Shudo did not know. And it was silly to guess because the woman's mind is far ahead of his own and her inventions always surpassed his expectations. Plus, asking her about them always resulted in her going off on a tangent for hours that Shudo just did not have the brain capacity to handle right now. There was too much on his mind, and he would like to complain for once. It seemed like he was always listening to others, and no one listened to him. Just because he was a prince did not mean he did not have worries or insecurities. May glanced up at the prince from the sand as she fiddled with a strap on her baby. She let out a huff of amusement before stating, "As a matter of fact, I do." At her answer, Shudo turned his body towards her more so he did not have to strain his neck so much. May's answer shocked him a little. He assumed the woman might hate the idea of having to be destined to one soul, but it seemed the idea brightened her mood more than usual. Maybe in this love area, she was like every other girl and dreamed of meeting the one someday as well. But May was not every girl, and neither was the Countess. "Well," he said, drawing out the words slightly as he began to muse his thoughts, "how can you be certain to find them?" May looked up at Shudo again, opening her mouth, but it seemed the question was rhetorical as Shudo continued on, flailing his arms around still clutching rocks in his hands. "And if you do find them, are they really the one for you, or do you only think they are?" He briefly paused again, but May just continued her work as she silently let Shudo release his annoyances. Shudo fought to hide his surprise, but at this point he could not contain his shock that someone was actually listening to him. Yes, Izuku listened to Shudo, but it made the prince feel like he was forcing his friend to hear his grievances. Izuku was always there for him, but the poor guard needed a break once in a while too. "Nevertheless," Shudo proceeded, "and what happens if the person you're supposed to be with never appears, or she does, but you're too distracted to notice?" "You learn to pay attention," was May's answer. She tried to show her amusement at the prince's growing flush as he voiced his racing thoughts. She could only assume that Shudo did not open up to many people, and if he did, it was very few and far between. Then, Shudo scoffed as he tried to cool his heated cheeks and tried to distract her eyes from his face with more arm flails. "Let's say God puts two people on Earth, and they are lucky enough to find one another. But one of them gets hit by lightning." He took a pause, staring at May's raised eyebrows and smirk. He flopped his arms back to his sides and continued in a slightly raised tone, "Well, then what? Is that it? Or, perchance, you meet someone new and marry all over again? Is that the lady you're supposed to be with, or was it the first? And if so, when the two of them were walking side by side, were they both the one for you and you just happened to meet the first one first? Or was the second one supposed to be first?" Towards the end he began to mumble, but just when May was going to say something, Shudo spoke up again with a hand grasping his chin in thought and his eyes to the ground. "And is everything by chance, or are some things meant to be?" May giggled slightly, and as she stood up from the ground she interjected, "You can't leave everything to fate, silly." Brushing off her skirt, she now faced the prince fully and explained, "She's got a lot to do. Sometimes you must give her a hand." Reader was out with a hog to search for truffles. If she managed to find good ones, they could get some good money for the small fungus. The search, however, was tedious and usually took hours, but the sun was starting to peek out of the clouds, and the brightness brought a smile to Reader's face. The small wood on her father's manor's property was right next to the lake, and it looked so peaceful and silent today. The humid air made her dress stick uncomfortably to her body from sweat, and she could not help but think how refreshing the water would feel. So, kneeling next to the truffle hog, she tied him to a nearby tree, and she placed the truffles she gathered so far into her apron's pouch. Standing at the shore, she removed her apron and skirt, but kept on her undergarments, slip, and bodice on, just in case she happened to run into others. She wanted a dip in the lake, not unwanted wandering eyes. With one more glance at the hog to make sure he was comfortable and still tied, she ran into the water. The shock of the freezing water was unpleasant at first, but after a minute Reader's body adjusted to the cold and immediately felt refreshed. She felt the sweat clear off her body and the dirt and soot lift off her skin. She scrubbed at the stains from her clothing as best she could, and mentally made a note to clean off her skirt and apron as well after she swam around for a bit. With one more glance to see if the hog was all right, Reader began to swim farther from the shore and closer to the middle of the lake. When she no longer felt the ground underneath her feet, she began to float on her back, closing her eyes in relaxation. For the first time in years, Reader felt weightless and peaceful. The water gently lapped over her ears, and all she heard was her calm heartbeat and the once-in-a-while disturbance of swimming fish. It would turn out to be a foolish decision to cover one of her senses. But how was she supposed to know that a figure coming from the other side of the lake would be walking straight to her? Yes, walking. It seemed that May's new invention was water shoes, and these said water shoes looked like two small boats that May wore as shoes. However, May was a very casual and friendly woman, and saw that someone was out for a swim. With Shuto watching from the shore, she began to walk on the water to the swimming figure to make some conversation and, hopefully, make a new friend with someone who enjoyed the outdoors. At this point, Reader had begun to hear strangely timed splashes under the water, but she assumed it was fish jumping from the water for food. However, once she heard a cry of, "Glad the clouds cleared," she opened her eyes to find a woman standing above the water looking at her with a large smile, and acting as if this was the most normal thing for anyone to see during the swim in the afternoon that I in the middle of a lake. So, naturally, Reader screamed and almost drowned, effectively scaring May severely and making her fall into the lake as well. After a minute of the two women sputtering and trying to cough the water out of their lungs, they finally looked at each other. Reader looked at May with raised eyebrows and wide eyes, as May began to laugh hysterically at the whole situation. Reader's cheeks flushed, but the laugh was contagious, and her laugh soon joined the strange woman's. After a while, May's guffaws started to become giggles, and when she finally sighed, she smiled widely at Reader and apologized. "I'm very sorry, miss, for scaring you. You see, I was testing out my water shoes and saw you swimming. I figured you would enjoy some company." "Oh, I accept your apology. Sorry for screaming at you and making you fall into the lake." May flapped her hand up and down as she used her other arm to keep her afloat. The two women continued chatting for a little longer about the invention May was testing, and each one grabbing a water shoe, both began to make their way to shore where May's supplies and her friend were. The shore opposite of where Reader left her hog and truffles. May distracted Reader with conversation, and this made her unaware of the man who had now noticed them coming and ran to the shoreline to ask if they needed help. "Hatsum, are you all right?" May huffed at Shuto's use of her last name, but she was irritated of having to repeat that he could call her by her first name, so, letting out a slight giggle, she excused, "I should leave walking on water to the Son of God." Adjusting her hold on the shoe and gripping on Reader a little tighter because she began to slip a little, May continued, "Fortunately, I tripped over an angel." Letting out an over-exaggerated gasp, Shuto exclaimed, "Countess?" Reader's full attention now on Shuto and the fact that he is here, she felt a jolt of lightning shoot through her spine as her eyes met his. Her grip unknowingly loosened from May's arm and her eyes went incredibly wide. "Oh shit," she mentally screamed, but instead yelled, "Your Highness," right as her foot slipped on a rock and she was once again submerged in the water. She shot right back up, with May's help, but she was soaked and could not stop coughing up water. Shudo shouted in concern and told her to be careful. Reader's ears were filled, but much to her surprise, Shudo took off his cloak and began draping it along her shoulders. She felt her cheeks flush, and with the continuous surprises and now the presence of the prince, Reader's heart was hammering in her chest. Reader could not help but mentally seethe, I should write a book called, How to Embarrass Yourself in Front of the Future King. The hell, he must think I'm insane. Reader tried to compose herself as best she can and thanked Shudo profusely for the cloak and let him help her back to shore. May grumbled, thanks a lot, but joined the two others anyway. Shudo helped Reader take a seat on the ground facing the lake, and once he made sure she was comfortable, he sat right beside her, with no regards towards personal space, making Reader's cheeks heat once again. The two spent some time in silence as May fiddled with her babies behind them. Shudo's head and eyes roamed around as the normally stoic man tried to hide a smile that has been wanting to burst since he saw the very woman he has been thinking of nonstop since yesterday. He thought it truly must be fate for him to keep running into her. So, began Shudo as he finally looked at Reader's face, where are your attendants? Reader's eyes widened slightly at the prince's question, and she momentarily forgot that she had told him she was a countess, not a servant. Her eyes shot towards the lake, too scared to meet his eager eyes that seemed to be burning a hole into her head. I decided to give them the day off, she lied. Shudo laughed at her answer, thinking it was absurd, and asked, a day off? From what life? At the prince's blatant idiocy, Reader's eyes returned to his and she scoffed, don't you ever tire of having people wait on you all the time? Yes, but they're servants, he casually dismissed with a scrunch in his brows, but his smile still teasing, it's what they do. Well, Reader continued to scold in annoyance and utterly insulted by Shudo's teasing, I wish I could dismiss mine as easily as you do yours. She stood abruptly and removed her cloak, much to the prince's dismay. She excused, I must be going. Shudo let out a huff of surprise and laughter as he also stood and stepped in front of her before she got away. You're angry with me? Wow, a true detective, Reader grumbled in her head, but let out a short-clipped, no. Admit it? Reader tried not to act flustered when Shudo leaned in close to her face. Well, yes, if you must know, she sighed as she crossed her arms. Why? Because you are trying to bait me with your snobbery? I am afraid, miss, that you are a walking contradiction, and I find that rather fascinating, explained Shudo honestly with slightly hooded eyes, effectively making Reader flustered once again. Me? Shudo gave her a boyish smile and said, yes, you spout the ideas of a utopian society, yet you live the life of a courtier. That's what you think. And you, jabbed Reader, own all the land there is, and yet you take no pride in working it. Is that not also a contradiction? Shudo let out another amused scoff before teasingly whined, first, I'm arrogant, and now I have no pride. However do I manage that? You have everything and still the world holds no joy. And yet you insist on making fun of those who would see it for its possibilities. Shudo's expression went from teasing to wonder as he stared at Reader with awe. He felt truly lucky to have met someone like her. On the other hand, Reader was internally questioning why the prince aggravated her so. Not even Katsuki got on her nerves as much as Shudo did. How do you do it? He now asked her, still leaned in close. What? Live each day with this kind of passion? Don't you find it exhausting? Reader's eyebrows furrowed in thought as she answered, only when I'm with you. She brought out a teasing smile of her own, making Shudo laugh. Why do you like to irritate me so? Why do you rise to the occasion? The two laughed as May watched, shaking her head slightly. All of a sudden Reader heard her name being called from across the lake. She jolted at the sound, making Shudo lean away from her and raise his eyebrows in question. She quickly shoved the cloak into Shudo's arms as she began to hastily excuse, forgive me, your highness, I've lost track of the hour. But the wind is picking up. It's perfect, exclaimed May as she held up a strange contraption that Reader remembered she had called a kite earlier when they were returning to shore. May practically shoved it in Reader's arms before she had the chance to run away. I am sorry, Reader guiltily said as she turned to leave. Shudo asked her to wait, she merely slowed her pace, but did not turn around. But Shudo took the chance anyway. I'm playing tennis with a count tomorrow. Will you come? I must go, she yelled as she continued to run away with a lazy wave over her shoulder. Shudo huffed in disappointment, and without sparing a glance from the woman that kept running from him, he grumbled, "Why does she keep doing that?" "Tsuyu, where are the candlesticks?" Namuri asked in annoyance as the 3 servants finished serving dinner and stepped aside to wait to be called. Once Tsuyu was addressed, she stepped forward to listen to her emissaire's complaint. "We can hardly see our plates." Tsuyu bowed in apology and explained, "They're missing, my lady. I've searched high and low. The painting in the upstairs hall is gone too," added Mina. Reader looked over to Mina in astonishment at the news. It was the first time she was hearing of anything from the house missing. Mina gave an apologetic look, and Reader could only assume that they kept it from her to protect her feelings. This was her father's house, after all. If only she had not wasted so much time with the silly prince, she would have been here to protect the items her father had earned with his hard work. Why was she so willing to let the prince distract her? Why was it so easy for the prince to distract her? Namuri scoffed and hardened her stare at Tsuyu. So this is how I'm treated after all our years together? She released her glare on Tsuyu and began to sip from her dinner wine before her velvety voice mumbled, "My husband's prized possessions?" With a half-hearted sigh, she placed her glass back down on the table and looked back at Tsuyu and Mina. "Well, I shall just garnish your wages until the pilfered items are returned. Is that quite understood?" Tsuyu and Mina could only bow their heads in disappointment and whisper, "Yes, ma'am." Namuri clearly was not done with her harsh words, for she added, "Perhaps I should ship you overseas with the rest of the thieves?" "Oh," exclaimed Ochako, partly annoyed by her mother's complete lack of empathy, but also because she remembered something she heard today. "Didn't you hear? The prince went to the king and asked him to release all those men." Reader, unable to contain herself, gasped, "He didn't." Ochako excitedly hummed at Reader's attention, but everyone else looked at her as if she lost her head. It had gotten awkwardly quiet, and all Reader could do was look down at her shoes in embarrassment. When everyone finally released their eyes on her, she let out a quiet and relieved sigh and returned her attention to Ochako. "And now by royal decree, any man who sails must be compensated." Reader could not contain the smile this news brought her. It seems the arrogant prince could listen and take action, after all. Maybe he was not as bad as she thought. Maybe he was not like his father. Namuri left out a huff in amusement and said, "Compensated? Oh, honestly. What is the world coming to?" Cammy hummed in agreement, and with a flick of her wrist, she shook her cup to let Reader know that she needed more wine. As Reader grabbed the bottle, Cammy complained, "What I want to know is, who is this countess everyone keeps talking about?" Reader began to carefully pour the wine, hoping it was not obvious that she was clearly listening to their conversation now. There must have been 10 courtiers speaking of her today, and how the prince fell all over himself. "Well," seethed Namuri in a quiet and guarded tone, "we shall find out who she is and bury her." Out of shock, Reader just barely caught the wine bottle before it spilled all over Cammy. Cammy and Namuri looked at her suspiciously, and she felt her cheeks warm. All she could do was mutter out an apology and scurry off with the bottle after she finished pouring some for Cammy. When she stepped back to the side, she could not help but feel a shiver of fear up her spine. It's, after all, not a normal thing for her stepmother to threaten to kill her. Shudo's senses were on overdrive. Do these women not understand that screaming while he is serving will make him lose focus? It is not like he is one of those show gypsies, he is playing tennis for FS sake. The amount of tissues stuffed throughout his shirt is proof enough that the summer morning is ungodly hot, and he probably smells terrible. Why women scream for that, he did not know. All Fuyumi could do was give him a once-in-a-while small thumbs up to show her encouragement, because her voice would drown in the women's cries. Even his tennis partner for the day, the man's name was forgotten from Shudo's mind as soon as he learned it, was getting annoyed with the crowd of women gathered to watch the match. What mainly disappointed him most, however, was the obvious absence of a certain countess he invited to watch. He has also yet to see the family he was to repay with a tour around the kingdom either, but they could be lost in the throngs as well. But what is the point in playing his best if the one person he actually wanted to be here was not here? He has not wanted to see someone this much since his mother was around. The Countess brought out a better side of himself, and he could feel his opinions and thoughts expanding whenever she was around. However, her absence might be distracting him a little too much. The tennis ball hit him right on his forehead. The same place where a bruise formed from the apple throwing he acquired a few days ago and was just starting to heal. Shudo grunted in pain as he stumbled slightly backwards, and the many women in the stands gasped in shock and worry. He steadied his footing and shook his head slightly to try to remove Countess Emi Fukukado from his brain. He waved off Izuku and Tenya to let them know he was fine, and the crowd sighed in relief. Shudo started to wonder if they were using audience reaction cards. Or did all women react the same exact way? There was much for Shudo to learn. When his opponent knew Shudo was ready to play again, the man served the ball over to Shudo's side of the court. Shudo and the Count hit the ball back and forth a few times, and the ball's speed increased with each hit. Shudo had gotten so focused, finally, that he failed to pay attention to how close he had gotten to the separation wall from the stands. When he stretched for the ball, he slammed the side of his knee into the top edge of the wall and effectively fell right over it and fell into the stands. Unfortunately for Shudo, but fortunately for them, he fell onto a few women. Izuku and Tenya rushed over to help Shudo off the ground and push away the swarming women who seemed to take joy in stealing the prince's sweaty rags that had fallen out of his sporting attire. Shudo annoyedly ripped off the netting that is used to separate the stands from the court from his body. Shudo looked over to Izuku, who was trying very hard to not start laughing as Tenya chopped his arms at Shudo for being so careless about his surroundings. Shudo only rolled his eyes, but dismissed his friends with kindness. They helped him after all. Maybe it was a good thing the Countess did not show, for she would have laughed at how clumsy he was being. Once Shudo got back into his receiving stance, the Count cleared his throat, smugly smirked, and pointed something behind Shudo. Shudo huffed in annoyance, for all he wanted was to get this stupid game over with, but, nevertheless, he turned around and was surprised to see Cammy, one of the women he was taking on a tour today. He tried to look friendly and not at all disappointed that it was not the Countess. He realized she was holding the ball that he tried to hit earlier, so he made his way over to her and take it back. Giving a tight smile, he greeted, "You're looking well, Cammy." "You're welcome to look, Your Highness," she smugly replied, making Shudo immediately uncomfortable and at a loss for words. All he could do was mutter out a thank you and turn around and rush away, returning to his game. Meanwhile, the manor's servants were working a stand at the market selling as much of their small supply of vegetables and fruit that they could. Rita was trying to make their cabbage presentable when she felt a disturbance in her vicinity. Just her luck she had to run into Shigaraki today. The crusty bastard stopped in front of their stand with his two followers, Toga and Dabi. Rita tried not to show fear in their presence, but just Dabi's appearance could send her running. Half of his body is practically mummified burns that he held to his undamaged skin with piercings. His hair was an unnatural matte black that he no doubt dyed it daily with powders. His eyes were the only color he bore besides black. They were a bright turquoise, but were filled with very little life. Toga was more sweet-looking compared to her counterparts, but her ash-blonde hair was pulled untidily to the top of her head in two buns. Her golden-yellow eyes were always filled with happiness, but always held a dash of crazed. Toga, on many occasions, has told Rita how lovely her blood must be and how she would love to see it. Rita was always uncomfortable in her presence and felt unnerved whenever one of Toga's knives would flash from underneath her sleeves. Shigaraki was called a crusty bastard for a reason. Katsuki liked to joke that the man would turn to dust before the age of 30, but he was at least 35 now, so that dream was crushed. Shigaraki's hair was a pale blue that he kept shoulder length and scraggly, the ends uneven. His skin was incredibly dry and was chipping off around his lips. His skin was unnaturally pale, and with the combination of his red eyes made him look sickly. He also had the habit of itching his neck when he was aggravated and nervous, which always made dead skin fly off. And the worst thing about him? He had a strange obsession with wanting to own Rita and make her his wife. Suffice to say, he was a rich, crusty bastard that no one, besides lowlives, liked. "Rita Aizawa," he greeted in his scratchy, dry voice, "you get prettier every week." If Reader had food in her body right now, she would have vomited. She would rather be a spinster and die alone than be the object of affection to this creep. She glared at Shigaraki as he stood right before her and her cabbages. His followers stayed a few steps behind to look out for any thief, as if they were not thieves themselves. "And you, Shigaraki, are wasting your flattery," gritted Reader as she turned away to gather more vegetables to place on the tables. Unfortunately, he followed her around the tables to stay near her. "It's a pity your soil's the best in the village and yet so poorly tended." Reader slammed down the carrots she grabbed right in front of him as Mina jumped into the conversation with Tsuyu right behind her with hands on her hips. "We have limited resources, sir. We do the best we can." Shigaraki feigned sorrow and pouted his lips at Reader and asked, "Anything I can do?" "Perhaps you should bring it up with the Baroness and stick to shopping," suggested Tsuyu haughtily. Shigaraki rolled his eyes at the two servants trying to distract him from Reader, but he was like a snake and he just needed to get his teeth sunk into her. So it was no surprise when he waved them off and whined, "I'd rather discuss it with Reader, if you don't mind." He leaned over the table where Reader was trying to organize the carrots nicely. Disturbing her space, she looked up at him in annoyance which turned to disgust when he murmured, "I may be much older than you, child, but I am well endowed as evidenced by my estate." He then started to reach for her neck as he whispered, "I've always had a soft spot for the less fortunate." His hand was slowly still reaching out to her, but she froze in fear as he continued, "You need a wealthy benefactor, I need a young lady with spirit." Reader jerked back and grabbed the first thing she saw, shoved it in his face and said with the fakest smile she has ever placed on her face, "Prunes?" Mina and Tsuyu held in their laughter when Shigaraki straightened up again and declined Reader's offer. In agitation he began to aggressively scratch his neck. "I'll buy nothing this week, and you do well to remember that without my generosity, your pathetic little farm would cease to exist." He leaned in once more, and this time Reader made sure to lean as far away as possible. "So, I would be very, very careful if I were you." Tsuyu, Mina, and Reader watched in seething silence as Shigaraki and his crones followed him out of the marketplace. Once they were out of sight, Reader let out a large relieved sigh for having to survive yet another horrible interaction with the crusty bee. "Oh, horrible man," seethed Mina as she began to aggressively throw vegetables on the tables. "If he didn't buy a bushel of vegetables every week, I'd spit on him." But Reader jumped at the sound of her best friend's greeting. She looked up to see him pushing through the poor innocent townsfolk who were not prepared for his abrasive shoving. She started to giggle at his antics and his usual scrunched-up face. She could tell he had seen the altercation and was most likely on his way to ask if she was okay. He was most likely berating himself internally because he did not get here in time to protect her. Reader liked to compare him to a guard dog, but Katsuki did not appreciate that joke very much. Usually he'd end up yelling that he was much better than a defendu fleabag. "Hello, Suki." Katsuki grumbled a greeting to Reader and gave a lazy wave to Tsuyu and Mina. He took a look at the vegetables and as he started to grab some, he began his interrogation. "So, what did Krusty BSRD say this time, huh? He didn't touch you with his dry as F hands, did he?" Reader sighed. "It was just the usual, and he didn't touch me, thank God, but he didn't buy anything this week, so the Baroness might not be very happy about that." "F what she thinks," he assured as he stepped closer to Mina to pay her for the vegetables. As he handed her the needed coins he said, "Besides you're busy helping me with painting tomorrow. It's your day off, right?" Reader rolled her eyes and whined, "Suki, it's my only day off during the week. Why do I have to help you with painting for it? What if I had plans?" "I know you don't have FING plans, so don't give me that sheet," he grumbled as he glared at Reader while Mina wrapped up his vegetables in paper. "You're gonna get out of that FNG manner for a dimmin' day, and you're gonna FNG enjoy it. Got it?" Reader just giggled, but agreed to it anyway. When Katsuki took the vegetables back from Mina, he rubbed Reader's head in farewell, and the three servants watched him as he gracefully shoved people out of his way again. Here, Shudo showed off the dark brown rectangle-shaped food item to Kami. "Never have you tasted anything so delicious?" The tour was going rather well, but the prince had to have a lot of help from Izuku and Tenya, but even Izuku was getting distracted by one of the sisters, Ochako. which meant more unwanted and uncomfortable time alone with Cammy and her mother watching far too eagerly. Shudo tried to be civil as he handed the piece of chocolate to Cammy, but all she did was open her mouth. Was he supposed to just put it in there? That's disgusting. How is he supposed to know where it's been? He tried to look to Tenya for help, but he merely shrugged his shoulders. So, Shudo shoved it into her mouth, almost making her choke, but she recovered quickly with a hand to her mouth. Cammy chewed as nicely as she could, but the flavor was really good and she could not help but release a from its taste. Like it? Shudo questioned awkwardly. Like it? Why, it's positively sinful. What's it called? Shudo heard Izuku suppress a laugh at Cammy's strange reaction, but Shudo tried to smile kindly when he answered, chocolate. The Spanish monks keep sending bricks of it. Cammy hummed in approval as they continued through the marketplace stands. When she caught eye of one particular stand, she turned excitedly to Shudo and said, "These are our servants, Your Highness." Shudo's smile turned genuine as he wished to meet the people who worked hard for this family. Perhaps, even talk to the servant who threw apples at him finally and get the chance to apologize properly. He did not withhold his own excitement when he asked, "Really? Oh, I'd love to meet them." When they approached the stands and greeted Mina and Tsuyu, they both gasped in horror and froze in their places. Rita was right behind them trying to fetch a chicken from the cage that a customer had bought, but it was being awfully finicky. Once she turned around, she caught the prince's appearance in front of her and in shock and desperation threw the poor chicken at his face. With the distraction, she made a run for it while Mina and Tsuyu rushed to remove the chicken from the prince. Nemuri came rushing forward and yelled, "What are you doing? Trying to scare the prince to death?" "We were startled. That's all," uttered Mina as she tried to avoid the prince's eyes as if they burned her. Shudo looked between the two servants in confusion and kept pointing his finger at them. Izuku and Tenya watched the whole situation with interest. "Were there just two of you?" Shudo asked as he continued to look around for the servant who ran away. Tsuyu merely kept her face stoic and answered with feigned assurance, "And the chicken, Your Highness?" It was the evening of the chicken incident, and now Ijiro could not stop laughing about the story Mina and Tsuyu had told him. Reader still could not believe that she actually threw a chicken into the prince's face. She could see why it would be amusing, but she felt really bad. First she threw apples at him and now a chicken. What was next? How much more can she embarrass herself in front of royalty until God takes pity on her and gives her some much-needed luck and grace? Oh, who was Reader kidding? She was going to be embarrassing herself till the day she died, it seemed. Reader aggressively stabbed the burning logs in Nemuri's fireplace with a poker as she internally berated herself. Nemuri was in a good mood because of the tour given to them today by the prince. She could not help but be pleased with how well Cammy did. From her observations, Cammy and Shudo were the perfect couple and clearly were meant for each other. She could already imagine the appealing wedding. Her daughter would be a vision in white, and the best thing, she would become queen. Well, someday at least. The king has to stand down and anoint Shudo first, of course. Behind her changing screen, Nemuri had changed into her nightgown and was now draping her bedrobe over it. With grace, she flitted to the chair beside her fireplace to sit and let Reader brush her hair. "We must press for a quick engagement," she stated as she sat down and Reader grabbed the brush from the table. Reader went behind Nemuri and began to slowly brush through the knots in her hair from having to wear it. Up all day. Paris at Christmas. Can you imagine? Reader gave Nemuri a small, polite smile. Nemuri has traveled to many places, but Reader has been stuck in Mizutofu all her life. Granted, she has never really wanted to leave, but that was mainly because she did not want to leave the manor unattended. She was worried that if she left, it would fall apart. Yes, she had Mina, Tsuyu, and Ijiro to watch over it, but if she was going to travel, she was going to take them with her, obviously. It would not be fair, nor fun, to travel alone. Giving Reader a pitying look, Nemuri soothed, "No, I don't suppose you can." Reader refrained herself from rolling her eyes at her stepmother. She truly wonders if Nemuri took joy in putting down the less fortunate. Especially Reader. It seemed that the older woman only showed concern for Cammy. Not even Ochako received the motherly love that all young women need. Was it really that hard for Nemuri to be empathetic to others? Was it really that hard for Nemuri to care for others besides herself and the daughter she had raised to be an absolute brat and tyrant? My mother was hard on me too, you know. Nemuri gave Reader a sideways glance as she placed the brush back on the table and stepped to Nemuri's right side to listen to her. Reader knew she was trying to relate to her in some way, but these conversations always left Reader questioning Nemuri's intentions. Nemuri sighed and continued, "She taught me that cleanliness was next to godliness." Nemuri's eyes looked at the wall opposite of her in remembrance as she wiped her hands together slowly. "She forced me to wash my face at least 20 times a day, convinced it was never clean enough." Reader remained silent as she listened to Nemuri. Her stepmother returned her eyes to Reader's with a small smile on her face, but she continued to absent-mindedly wipe her hands together. "But I was very grateful to her. She wanted me to be all that I could be," she explained. Nemuri's chest puffed out as she bragged, "And here I am, a baroness, and Cammy shall be queen." Reader could only give her another small smile, but she really did not care if Cammy became queen. Just because the prince was changing did not mean he was actually a good person. Yes, you got along with him well, and his company was exciting, but he was still a spoiled prince that you thought Cammy deserved. As long as they left you alone with your home, you had no complaints. When she tried to turn away to leave, thinking Nemuri was now done with her, she was stopped by her stepmother's hand holding her and spinning her back around. "It's a pity you never knew your mother," she said sadly. Reader felt warmth in her chest by Nemuri's genuine look of concern. Reader rarely got attention from the older woman, so, like a child, she melted easily for it. "There must be a little bit of her in you somewhere." Nemuri used her other hand to lead Reader down to kneel in front of her so she could look at her better. Reader kept trying to remind herself that this must be a fluke, but the attention was all she needed more than anything. "I wish I knew what she looked like," admitted Reader with a wistful look to her face. "Yes." Nemuri agreed as she patted Reader's head and said, "Well, we must never feel sorry for ourselves, must we? No matter how bad things get, they can always be worse." "Yes, ma'am." Nemuri's eyes softened as she observed Reader's face, and with the saddest expression she sighed, "You have so much of your father in you sometimes, I can almost see him looking out through your eyes." With a large smile, Reader asked, "Really?" Nemuri's eyes had frosted over, and with a clear of her throat and a shift in her seat she clipped, "Yes, well, your features are so masculine." Reader's smile faltered as Nemuri continued, "And to be raised by a man." Nemuri paused to think of the proper thing to say. "No wonder you're built for hard LBR." Slightly insulted, but still curious with Nemuri's behavior, Reader asked, "Did you love my father?" Nemuri could not meet Reader's eyes anymore as she fought back tears. Reader could not tell if they were genuine, or if Nemuri was faking them. Either way, her answer still did not please the young servant. "Well, I barely knew him." Nemuri pushed on Reader's shoulder slightly as she ordered, "Now, go away, I'm tired." Reader left her father's old room, trying to hide her immense disappointment. Suki, look, it's floating." Katsuki huffed in annoyance as he glanced from his painting to glare at Reader. They had met a few minutes from the manor in a field where Katsuki could paint in peace and quiet. He was beginning to regret inviting his best friend who has been spending the time playing with a kite that she was gifted by Hatsum, an artist and inventor that Katsuki looks up to. Maybe he was a little jealous that Reader got to meet her and Katsuki did not, but she was still disrupting his peace. He also did not understand why she was in such a good mood about her stepsister's possibility of marrying the prince. If Cammy became queen, Katsuki would personally put it upon himself to get the F out of this kingdom. "Why the F are you so happy for?" he growled as he tried to perfect a tree that he has been working on for the past hour. Sometimes being a perfectionist was a negative trait to have, but at least his paintings were the best. Better than his father's, at least. "You're gonna be effing bathing in sheet if they get married." Reader held onto the kite as it swayed in the air from the wind. Hearing Katsuki's complaint made the servant laugh loudly and shoot back, "And I don't know why it bothers you so much. I could care less." As Reader began to jump around Katsuki with the kite, the artist released another angered huff and yelled, "You're effing lying. The prince would be your shitty brother-in-law, and you, the effing dumbass Countess Emi Fukukado, would be bringing them nasty but breakfast in bed. Reader stopped a few feet from Katsuki and looked at him with exasperation and explained, yes, but then they would move into the palace and I could stay with the manor. She began walking around with the kite once again, circling around a hay pile as Katsuki glared at her idiocy and ridiculous belief that Nemuri would actually let her keep the manor. That's all that matters. Katsuki let out a PFT because he knows her too well. You like him. Admit it, dumbass. Reader stopped in her tracks as you rolled her eyes at Katsuki and yelled, nope. Katsuki laughed at her lie, but his attention was brought to the distance where he saw two men riding horses coming straight for them. He growled at the sight of Izuku and Prince Shudo. With the sight of the prince, Katsuki worried slightly for Reader, but a smile grew on his face as he thought of an idea to get her flustered. And I suppose if you saw the rich yesterday again you'd dash? Reader smiled brightly at Katsuki, oblivious to the approaching men behind her, and said, I'd walk right up to him and say, Your Highness, my family is your family. Please, take them away. But here's your big chance. The fuckers headed this way. Reader let out a very unladylike sheet and quickly jumped behind the hay pile to hide. Katsuki muttered a fingy coward under his breath at her rush to hide. Once her presence was hidden, she held on tight to the kite absent-mindedly, hoping Katsuki would not make it known that she was here, and the prince and his guard could get the hell out of here. Oh, hello, Kaken, Izuku greeted Katsuki, making Reader's eyebrows furrow in thought. This must have been the childhood friend that Katsuki always complained about to her. Although she could not see anything, the boy sounded very sweet and pleasant. Katsuki always made it sound like the man was a monster spawned from Satan himself. Katsuki growled and muttered, shitty Deku, at Izuku as the guard's smile widened at the sight of an old friend. Shudo knew Katsuki and his strange annoyance with Izuku, but he did not have time to listen to them squabble. He cleared his throat, gaining the men's attention so he could get the hell out of here and fetch Hatsum, who disappeared to who knows where. We are looking for Mei Hatsum, he explained. Katsuki's eyes widened at the name, but he kept his glare stained on his face. We're to go to the monastery together. Have you seen her? Katsuki sighed at the question, but as he glanced at the hay pile Reader was behind, he knew that she liked the prince, even if she did not know it herself yet. He really was not getting the peace and quiet he wanted. Now he was being bothered by Deku and the prince of all people. This was supposed to be a relaxing day off for his friend and him, but it was not going to plan, but it might still pan out in both their favor still. Katsuki huffed, Hatsum? Yeah, no, your highness. He really hated talking nicely. Shudo glared at Katsuki and his lie because he could see an invention flying right above him. With his own huff, Shudo asked, well, is that not her flying contraption? Where did you get it? Reader's eyes went wide and she quickly released the handle of the kite, making it fly and wobble awkwardly in the wind. Shudo's eyebrows furrowed in confusion at its sudden careless liftoff. Katsuki did not like his tone, and it sounded like the prince was accusing him of stealing. Katsuki growled and mentally promised himself to destroy Shudo in the next jousting match, but, still keeping his glare, answered, from the Fing Countess Fukukado. She is a friend of his. Heh, Katsuki praised himself. Sheet. Katsuki Udam. Reader's eyes widened and she had to fight the urge to go out and slap Katsuki's stupid head. What was he thinking? Shudo's spirits and eyes brightened at the name. Was there really someone else who knew of the ever-elusive woman? And Katsuki of all people? Completely disregarding the man's glare and improper swearing, Shudo excitedly asked, You know her? His eyes began to look pleadingly at Katsuki, making the artist rather uncomfortable, and begged, Please, I must find her. Where is she staying? Katsuki's face morphed into a conspiratorial smirk, knowing that this was going his way. Izuku looked at his old friend in suspicion, but stayed silent as Katsuki lied. She's staying with her shitty cousin, the Baroness Nemuri Kiyamizawa. Shudo groaned and looked at Izuku in annoyance at the name. Izuku shrugged at the prince with a smile that said, What can you do? Shudo thought that was very unhelpful, but he did really want to see Reader. However, he really did not want to deal with the Baroness and her daughter again. He did not mind Ochako, but Kami bothered the shit out of him. Looking at the sky and sighing, Shudo hummed, "That does present a problem." Katsuki's smirk grew at the prince's reaction. With a quick glance at the hay pile again he declared, "But I do know that the countess is there. Alone. By herself. As we FNG speak." Reader's glare deepened as she imagined Katsuki melting in a pot of iron. Was it too late to choose a new best friend? Perhaps Tsuyu would like that title instead? Shudo, however, perked up at the news. He smiled at Katsuki, making the artist snarl in disgust at the sight. To Katsuki it was really weird to see the prince smile. "Excellent. Nice painting," praised Shudo offhandedly as he began to ride quickly to the manor to meet the countess. Once the prince and his guard were out of sight and hearing range, Reader rushed out with an exasperated yell and a slap to Katsuki's shoulder. All he did was laugh as he dodged another hand aiming for his head. "Katsuki, you FND, stupid gremlin." Katsuki let out a loud huff in amusement when he teased, "Didn't you hear? He praised me." "Ha!" Reader glared at him and scolded, "And because of you, he is headed towards my house." Katsuki looked her dead in the eyes and suggested, "Then you better start running." Reader glared at Katsuki for a few seconds longer as she tried to organize her racing thoughts, but there was only one right thing to do. So, in a blink of an eye and another laugh from Katsuki, Reader ran as fast as she could back to the manor. Reader burst through the back door of the manor screaming for Mina and Tsuyu to grab a dress for her to change into. With the unknown speed and skill that Reader did not know they possessed, they rushed to meet her in Ochako's room. As soon as they all entered, Mina rushed to the closet and picked one of the first dresses she saw and threw it in Tsuyu's face. As this was happening, Reader was disrobing herself as quickly as she could, leaving only her chemise on. Tsuyu began to throw on and tie the many layers to Reader's body. The dress was actually pretty, a nice navy blue with lace inlaid along the collar. Once Reader was dressed, Tsuyu pushed her into the chair facing Ochako's vanity. Mina immediately went to work brushing through Reader's tangles. She only had time to bring the top half of Reader's hair and, to make it look intentional, Mina placed a beret on top that was decorated with daisies and little flowers that matched the color of the dress she was wearing. When Mina's hands left Reader's head, Reader jumped to her feet and rushed down the stairs with Mina and Tsuyu right behind her to make sure the dress did not get stuck somewhere it should not be. When Reader reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Once at the door, she took a second to smooth out her dress and take in a deep breath. Once Reader looked ready, both Mina and Tsuyu collapsed on the top of the steps and began fanning themselves. Thank God the prince had taken the main road, or she would not have been ready in time. With a final wiggle of her body to keep her blood flowing, Reader moved the door open, only to be shocked with the prince's proximity to the door frame and his hand raised to pull the bell. Reader's face flushed slightly when her eyes met his and stepped back to distance herself from him. Shudo gave her a genuine smile as he lowered his hand. As two hearts began to beat faster at seeing the other, Reader in a breath at Shudo's smile and forced herself to sound as normal as possible and not as if she just quite literally ran here. "Your Highness," she gave him a wide smile. "What an unexpected surprise." Shudo's head tilted to the side when he asked, "Why, Countess? Do you not attend church?" "My faith is better served away from the rabid crowds," was her immediate answer. Shudo nodded his head in understanding. "Yes, I agree." Reader began to hear more horses coming from the road and saw two horses leading a coach. Shudo turned to watch it enter the courtyard as well when he explained, "Which is why I am bound for the monastery." His eyes met Reader's once again, and she tried not to fidget with her dress from the insane amount of nerves she was feeling. "It has an astonishing library. Since you're so fond of reading, I thought perhaps you might join me?" Reader looked at Shudo with wide eyes at his invitation, but she was quick to joke. "It is not fair, sire." She smiled softly and looked at him with bright eyes. "You have found my weakness, I have yet to learn yours." Shudo's smile widened as he leaned slightly closer to her and whispered, "Well, I should think it was quite obvious." Reader's face flushed at his intense stare, and she swore she felt her soul leave her body from his blatant disregard for personal space. Did she mind it? No, but if he got any closer she would fear she might faint. He smelled so pleasant, like a musky scent of vanilla. It made her knees weak. After another few seconds of quiet eye contact, Shudo turned to Izuku, waving a dismissing hand. He ordered, "Captain Izuku, I shall not be needing my horse or your services." He once again returned his turquoise and gray eyes back to readers. With a softened look he sighed, "Today, I am simply Shudo." Reader's eyes widened again when he reached his hand out to her. She looked down at it for several seconds, trying to steady her racing heart. Finally taking the leap, she reached her own hand out to wrap it around Shudo's. She felt a shock rush through her arm, but with the confidence of a countess, she smiled warmly at Shudo and let him lead her to the carriage. Ready to set off on an adventure with the prince. "Prince Shudo left early this morning, Baroness," explained Mineta as he hungrily gazed up at Nemuri. "No one seems to know where he went, but—" He began to ruffle through his pockets as Nemuri fought the urge to roll her eyes. She really did not like when things did not go her way. How is the prince supposed to fall for her daughter if he is not around to do so? "I've brought you something that will brighten up your day." Mineta finally acquired what he was digging for. Nemuri was unable to tell what it was because it was covered in a small bag, but, luckily, Mineta was more than happy to explain. He leaned forward and whispered to Nemuri that it was one of the princess's necklaces. Nemuri's devious smile widened at the news, and she now had the perfect plan to get Kami noticed by more of the royal court. Nemuri leaned away from Mineta slightly and rested her hand on his cheek, and with the voice of a siren she soothed, "Oh, you vicious, vicious man." Mineta's chest puffed at the praise and his smile was filled with lust. On the side, Ochako and Kami reacted in uncomfortable disgust at the small man and the fact that their mother was willing to talk to such a man. Once Nemuri received the bag from Mineta, she ordered her daughters to follow her in the church, already explaining the plan to Kami. It turns out Shudo still needed Izuku. Shudo had realized that in order to spend time with the woman he has been looking for, he needs to actually be with her. If he was to pull the carriage, then he would be unable to sit inside and talk to her. This was all pointed out to him by Izuku himself, of course. Once Shudo had helped the countess in the carriage, Izuku stepped up to him and scolded the prince for not understanding how normal courting works. In Shudo's defense, he has yet to actually court a woman, so could Izuku really blame him for not knowing what to do? Yes I can, was Izuku's answer. Now Shudo had something worse to think about. How to talk to a woman he is falling for as she sits across from him looking ungodly appealing. What do people talk about anyway? He wondered as he watched her gaze out through the small window on her left. He remembers he tried to have a civilized conversation with Izuku's childhood friend Katsuki once, but it did not end well. The loud man always complained that Shudo has the ability to put people to sleep with his attempts at conversation, but the countess has never seemed to mind. She actually seemed to like talking to Shudo. Maybe it was just everyone else? Maybe Emi was the only one who understood him? He awkwardly cleared his throat, bringing her full attention to him. Shudo tried to hide the fact that the eye contact made his heart leap in his chest by asking, "Do you enjoy strawberries?" The countess seemed a little surprised by Shudo's random question, but she merely smiled and explained, "I've never tried them, I'm afraid." She let out the sweetest-sounding giggle at Shudo's shocked expression. By the sound of her laugh, Shudo felt his cheeks warm, but tried to hide his rosy cheeks with a soft smile. "My apologies, I tend to forget that others do not have the same luxuries as I do." He sheepishly rubbed his hands on his thighs, trying to hide the fact that they were sweating. Emi's smile softened as she nodded her head. "I know," she said bluntly, "but that doesn't mean I do not want to hear about those luxuries, Your Highness." Shudo's smile returned with vigor. He began to tell Emi about his favorite fruits, some of which Emi has tried. Shudo learned of her favorite colors, foods, and hobbies, besides reading, of course. He still could not believe his luck of meeting a courtier that was not boring. Emi was so down to earth. He could not believe that she was real. She was so easy to talk to, they had a lot in common. Every minute spent on the ride to the monastery, Shudo felt himself fall more and more for the seemingly always elusive woman. All he had to do was convince Emi to stay. Although Reader had heard many times how appealing the architecture of the monastery was, words could not compare to the true beauty of its library and its stacks of shelves filled to the brim with books. Reader's smile was the widest it has ever been in her life at the sight of all the different titles, many she has never even heard of. Unable to contain herself, she rested her hand on the spines of the books as she walked by with Shudo right behind her, observing her reaction and feeling pride to know that he was the reason for her joy. Sparing a short glance at the prince, Reader gushed, "It makes me want to cry." Shudo let out a quiet laugh at her tear-filled eyes. Reader's face flushed at his appealing smile, and she could not help but to mentally remark that he seemed to smile a lot more than what others had said before. She remembers the rumors of the prince never smiling and treating everyone with only the minimum of manners. Cammy had mentioned many times when she saw Shudo he was always frowning. The possibility of Shudo only smiling due to Reader's presence made her chest warm. "Pick one," offered Shudo as he casually motioned to the shelves with a small smirk on his unfairly appealing face. Reader snorted as she gave him another quick glance, trying desperately to hide the way he was affecting her physically and mentally. "I could no sooner choose a favorite star in the heavens." Reader's face grew dreamy as she continued to look at the vast amount of books. Even if she was willing to take Shudo on his offer, the amount of novels to choose from was almost impossible. There were so many after all. She would be here trying to sift through all the titles all day. Shudo's eyes squinted in thoughtful curiosity as he asked, "What is it that touches you so?" Reader grinned at him kindly, appreciative that someone like him was interested in someone as insignificant as her. She sighed in remembrance as she explained, "I guess it's because when I was young, my father would stay up late and read to me." She stopped at a shelf and picked up a random novel to look at as she continued with Shudo right next to her, listening intently. "He was addicted to the written word, and I would fall asleep listening to the sound of his voice." Her voice trailed off as she felt tears in her eyes again from the visuals of her father's kind and loving eyes reading her a new book he had brought her. It was painful, but she tried to play it off by smiling at Shudo. Shudo's eyes narrowed slightly, noticing the change in her demeanor. "What sort of books?" "Science, philosophy." Reader trailed off as she placed the book back and moved over to a balcony that looked over the ground floor of the monastery. She watched the monks singing their hymn as she relived her most cherished memories of her father. "I suppose they remind me of him." She cleared her dry throat and took a deep breath and admitted, "He died when I was 8. Utopia was the last book he brought home." Shudo stood beside Reader at the balcony and looked down below as well. He felt his chest tighten at her words. He understood what it was like to lose a beloved parent at a young age. He looked at her side profile with sorrow and soothed, "Which explains why you quote it." She looked back at him, meeting his eyes with a look of sorrow engraved on her face. Shudo placed his hand on her resting forearm, trying to convey that he understood. She gave him a small smile as she looked out to the monks, trying to will herself to stop crying. "I would rather hear his voice again than any sound in the world." Shudo straightened, removing all emotion from his face, and began to descend the stairs once again. Reader, noticing the change, began to follow him with worry. When he abruptly stopped, Reader asked him if something was wrong and he turned around to meet her eyes again. Although his expression to everyone else would be stoic, Reader could see the pain in his eyes. She felt her heartbeat skip at the shock that the prince of all people knew how she was feeling. "In all my years of study," he started as he waved his arms around half-heartedly, "not one tutor ever demonstrated the passion you have shown me in the last 2 days." He scoffed in disbelief at this very fact. Not even his father, who yelled more than anyone in the world, showed as much drive and passion as her. This has truly opened his eyes and made him realize that he has been just as dull in comparison. "You have more conviction in one memory than I have in my entire being." He flopped his arms back to his sides as Reader looked at him with silent surprise that soon turned to worry. "Your Highness," she fretted as she stepped down the steps to join his side, "if there is anything I have said or done dash." Shudo raised his hand to silence her and said, "Please, don't. It's not you, it's me." Reader continued to look at him with worry, but she nodded her head in understanding. She could tell that the prince was not ready to talk about whatever made him so upset and closed off, but she could not help but assume it was most likely something to do with his mother. As far as the villagers were told, the queen passed away many years ago, but many have spread rumors that Queen Rei had attempted to hurt the king in some way and was taken somewhere far away to keep him safe. Reader has also heard that the queen had gone insane and was taken to a mental ward in another country. There were also rumors connecting the queen and her son Scar, but, no matter what was true, it was clear the queen's absence has affected Prince Shudo quite a bit. Reader quietly watched Shudo as he avoided her eyes and crossed his arms. She felt bad that he was feeling this way, so she decided to try to help him feel better. She smiled sweetly at him and cleared her throat to return his eyes to hers. When he looked at her, he felt his chest warm, and then it felt as if they were the only two souls in the world. Shudo could not help but thank the world that someone as amazing as her existed, and much to his ignorance, Reader was thinking the same exact thing about him. "Help me pick a book?" she offered quietly. Shudo's smile returned as he distracted himself with Reader's presence and finding her the perfect book to read. Nemuri practically dragged Cammy out of the church to hurry after the carriage holding the princess and her father. Cammy was clutching onto the stolen necklace, reciting the plan over and over in her head, reminding herself to act properly and convince the princess that this was not stolen but found. Ochako lazily followed behind, not having any interest in involving herself in her mother and sister's ridiculous plan. "Make haste, Cammy," hissed Nemuri as she practically threw Cammy towards the carriage. "It's now or never." Cammy gave her mother a glare from her force and tone, but gathered herself together as she stepped forward. She awkwardly cleared her throat, gaining the attention of Princess Fuyumi, King Enji, and their guest courtier of the day. Cammy fought the fear her heart sprung when the king's glare fell on her and tried her best to keep her eyes glued to the princess's instead. "Forgive me, Your Highness," apologized Cammy as she bowed quickly, "but you seem to have dropped this on your way out." Cammy held out the necklace towards the carriage's window as the princess gasped in amazement. She smiled graciously at Cammy, making Ochako roll her eyes, and said, "Why, my goodness." She reached out of the carriage to take the necklace off of Cammy's hands and gazed at it with wonderment. "I do not even remember putting it on." "Thank you." Fuyumi returned her full attention to Cammy and complimented, "It is a rare person indeed who would return such a valuable keepsake." Cammy curtsied properly to the princess and king now and said with a smirk, "You are magnanimous, Your Highness." Ochako silenced her snort at the absurdity and ridiculousness of her sister, but Nemuri's smug smile intensified at her daughter's success. Now all Cammy had to do was get something in return. As Cammy awkwardly and slowly turned away, Fuyumi turned to her guest and asked what Cammy's name was. Once she was told, Fuyumi called out to Cammy, who only made it a couple of tiny steps away. When Cammy was back in front of the carriage door, Fuyumi invited, "We shall have a chat tomorrow, you and I." Fuyumi glanced behind Cammy and noticed Nemuri standing with Ochako near the door. She waved at them and then said, "Bring your mother." Cammy's smirk widened as she curtsied again and breathed, "As you wish." And then he was covered in mud. It was like an explosion. Reader and Shudo laughed at Reader's story from her childhood. It was one of the times Katsuki came over to challenge her and she had tackled him into a mud puddle. The mud had gotten everywhere and she still remembers Tsuyu whining about having to clean mud out of Reader's clothes for months. Mitsuki still to this day refers to it as the incident. She had grumbled about her son's messy appearance, but always applauded him for never holding back from Reader. She always praised Reader on her strength and ability to keep up with Katsuki when most of the boys his age could not. Of course, when retelling the prince the tale, Reader kept out names and other possible details that could indicate who it involved and lead back to her. Sometimes it was hard to remember that she was still hiding her true identity from the prince. He was just so easy to talk to that Reader would forget that she was merely a servant. They were back in the carriage again, being pulled along the country road. The sun was almost fully risen, and the heat outside was pleasant, not too hot for a summer day. Shudo and Reader have been spending the time after the monastery and picking a book, telling stories back and forth between each other. She has learned that Izuku and Tenya are the closest thing Shudo has to best friends, even if they are his soldiers. He has also told stories about his siblings, mainly ones involving his sister, Fuyumi, because she is the only one still living in the castle with him. He has told very few stories involving his father, but Reader understands that the king is not known to be a very kind man, not even to his own family. Shudo's laugh turned into a chuckle as he gazed at Reader and her bright smile. This day has been going so well so far, and he was dreading having to say goodbye to her again. He feared he might not ever see her again. Sometimes it felt like she popped into his life just to leave like everyone else in his family. He wishes there was some way he could make this day last longer. Have more time to spend with her. Right as the prince was about to ask her if there was anything else she had wanted to do today, the carriage jostled slightly, and then all of a sudden tipped to the side, practically throwing Reader into Shudo's arms. Both riders flushed immediately and Reader jumped out of his arms, her skin feeling like it was on fire. Shudo awkwardly laughed, trying to show that he was not fazed, when in fact he was experiencing an existential crisis about how perfect she fit within his arms. This thought only made his flushed cheeks worse. Shudo asked if Reader was okay as he led her carefully out of the carriage. If Shudo was embarrassed before, he was beyond embarrassment now. Of course, on the day he was trying to be civil and court a lady, a wheel on his tire would break off. But this is exactly what he wanted, right? Would he actually get the extra time he wished for with her? Shudo hoped this day would never end. Well, this is terribly embarrassing. The prince rolled his lips as he grumbled about the wheel that was no longer attached to his carriage. With his hands in fists and resting on his hips, he tipped his head to the side with a frown on his face that made Reader make a very unladylike snort. Izuku also seemed to find Shudo's annoyance amusing as well as he stood next to Reader and tried to cover his giggles with his hand. This only made Reader cough from her attempts at hiding her snorts, thus making both burst into giggles and making Shudo roll his eyes in mock annoyance. After all, how could he be mad when her laugh was so ridiculously adorable? When Izuku and Reader's laughter finally subsided, Izuku said, "We'll head back to the monastery at once, Your Highness." He began to detach the two horses from the carriage, making Reader's eyes bulge at the fact she would most likely have to share a horse with the prince. Izuku's words worried Reader as she had already been away from home far longer than she had planned. She knew that Namuri and her stepsisters would most likely be home by now, and she would be asked questions no matter what time she returned. But if they were to return to the monastery, she would not be home till well after dinner time. It would not be fair to make Tsuyu, Mina, and Ijiro deal with Namuri and her wrath on their own. Especially since they were so willing to help her look presentable for the prince because of her last-minute decision to let him whisk her away. She wanted to blame Katsuki, but in the end it was her decision, not his. He was only helping her realize her true longing to be with the prince. And we, she emphasized, and she pointed between herself and Shudo, will be continuing on foot. With a determined nod towards Izuku, she briskly turned in the opposite direction of the monastery and began to walk. Shudo and Izuku shared a look of surprise as she merely continued without a second glance, assuming Shudo would follow. "But it's a half a day's walk," he whined. This made Reader stop and turn back to him with an amused grin, but kept her anxiety hidden. This was the only way she would get home in time for dinner to be served. Well, at least she thought it would. Plus, it would be more time to spend with the prince alone. "Honestly, Your Highness, where is your sense of adventure?" Reader gave him a smug look as she waited for him to follow her. He returned her grin and waved off at Izuku to dismiss him as he jogged over to stand beside Reader. Izuku just looked at the two with a smile on his face, knowing very well that they clearly wished to be alone. "Well, I guess if you put it that way. Now, we can't be too confident, ladies," ordered Namuri as she practically stormed through the door that Ijiro held open for her. He tried not to be too upset with the fact that he had just swept and will have to again. "The prince wasn't at church today, and we need to know why." Ochako, although she didn't always agree with her mother's methods, still felt a sting she usually always felt when she was left out. It was no surprise to her that Kami was her mother's favorite, but would it hurt her mother to include her in these plans every once in a while? So, it was not a surprise to Ochako, Namuri, Kami, and the servants when Ochako finally began to feel the exclusion and whine about it. "Kami gets to do everything." Ochako stopped right at the door as her mother and sister turned to her with rolling eyes and expressions of irritation that nearly mirrored each other. "Oh, don't be daft, Ochako," shot back Kami as she fully turned to face her sister with a smug grin. "The princess doesn't even know you exist." Ochako fixed a glare on her sister, not even bothering to hide her disdain. It was not like the princess knew who she was until today either. Ochako swears that if Cammy's head were to get any bigger, it would pop. And she would not be lying that if it happened she would be happy. Namuri sighed heavily at her daughters and snapped, "What Cammy does is for all of us, my dear." She looked into Ochako's eyes with a demanding glare, making Ochako play with her skirt under the pressure. "We are counting on you to help her get ready." Fully annoyed now, Ochako barked a sarcastic laugh and cried, "Lovely. Next thing you know, I shall be cleaning the fireplace with Reader." No longer wishing to be in their presence, Ochako stormed up the stairs and straight to her room to change for the rest of the day. "Where is that girl?" Namuri wondered aloud, not even bothered by her daughter's fit. "Probably off catching rabbits with her teeth." Cammy joked dismissively as she began to ascend the stairs to her own room as well. Namuri released an amused huff and merely scrunched her shoulders. As she started to climb the staircase, she was interrupted by Mina calling out to her to catch her attention. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but that gilded mirror in your bedchamber, did you move it?" Namuri scrutinized Mina, making her feel 2 feet tall before saying, "Of course not." "Why?" Mina slumped in defeat when she answered, "It's also missing." Namuri huffed in anger, and with a swift turn she seethed over her shoulder, "Then it too should come out of your pay." And with that she ascended the stairs to her room. Mina leaned against the railing heavily as Ijiro rushed over and helped her lean against him instead. Tsuyu, who also saw the whole interaction, walked over in annoyance at Mina and her blabbermouth. "Either you stop telling her when things go missing, or we will be paying her to work." Mina sighed in defeat and removed herself from Ijiro's grasp to go close the front door. As she grabbed the frame she turned to her 2 companions and said, "Good thing I didn't tell her about the tapestries." If there was one thing that Reader really liked about the prince, it would be how easy it was to communicate with him. However, as time passed by and the sun began to lower in the sky, Reader was realizing that they did not seem to be getting any closer to the castle. It did not help that they were surrounded by trees and hardly any sense of direction. It also did not help that the prince did not seem to have any idea where he was going. Which meant the Reader would most likely never return home at this point, and then be found guilty of kidnapping the prince because she was nothing more than a lowly servant. And no one believes a servant. "I'll climb a tree." Reader but practically yelled into the prince's ear, making him jump. He looked at her as if she were crazy, and maybe at this point she was. But before Shudo could even begin to voice his protests, Reader rushed to the tallest-looking tree she could see in this small clearing they had found themselves in, removed her top skirt leaving her undergarment breathes on full display much to the prince's flushed cheeks, and started to climb as if her life depended on it. Shudo called out to her, and rushed to the base to try to stop her, but she was far too stubborn and continued to climb against his wishes. Shudo huffed in defeat as he watched her skillfully climb as if she had done this many times before. In annoyance he strutted around the clearing as she climbed. It was beyond embarrassing that he had gotten them lost and, of course, he had to voice this to her if she was even listening. "You'd think I would know the way to my own castle." Reader was at the top of the tree now. She let out a giggle of amusement at Shudo's display and jokingly yelled back down at him when she found a good branch to get comfortable on. "Why is it men never stop for directions?" Reader laughed harder when the prince rolled his eyes at her. She began to look for the castle from her perch as Shudo paced through the clearing once again with his arms crossed. Within seconds Reader spotted the castle and whistled excitedly. "There it is. It is back that way." She pointed towards west, which meant that Reader and Shudo had been walking east this whole time. And so began Shudo grumblings again. "And I still can't believe I'm down here while you're up there." And, he shouted as he aggressively waved his hand up and down at her appearance, "In your undergarments, no less." Reader laughed joyfully at the prince's reactions and explained, "I couldn't climb up here in a gown, now could I? And besides, you might break your royal neck, and then where would we be?" Shudo looked up at her in disbelief. "You swim alone, climb rocks, rescue servants, is there anything you don't do?" Reader barked another laugh while spreading her arms to her sides and sighed, "Fly." Shudo joined in on her laughter. Once she was able to breathe normally again, Reader ordered, "Now, Turn around so I can climb back down. Shudo giggled as he shook his head and turned around, like she requested, only to be immediately punched right in the face by a vaguely familiar man with a very familiar head of yellow hair. Shudo took a few steps back from the force of the punch. His nose started to sting, but he could tell it had not broken. It seems that in the past few days, Shudo has been hit in the head quite a bit more than usual. And judging from the laughing, the said abuser was most definitely not alone. With a grunt, Shudo wiped his hand over his nose as he met the eyes of someone he was not expecting to see again. It was none other than the thief he had stopped from stealing Hatsume's painting. His bright yellow hair shined in the descending sun, almost blinding Shudo. Shudo glared at the thief as the rest of his friends, fellow gypsies it seemed, circled around the two. Shudo quickly grabbed his sword and prepared to fight this gypsy thief. He quickly glanced to where Reader was hastening her descent on the very large tree she had climbed. Shudo noticed her quickened pace and called out to her as he returned his glare back to his challenger. "Stay aloft, madam. There are games afoot." Reader, hearing this, rolled her lips in annoyance, and decided to ignore this request and continue her climb back down. "Like hell I would let him fight alone," she grumbled in her head as she rolled her eyes. Men and their silly insistence on being heroes. Down below, the prince and the thief are clashing their swords and parrying around each other. Between each attempt they would back away and continue circling around, not willing to take eyes off the other for more than 1 second. At this moment, Reader's foot got stuck in a vine that was hanging along the tree's trunk. With an exasperated sigh and a few choice words in her head, she tightened her along the bark of the tree and began to shake her foot to release it from the vine. A gypsy with shoulder-length black hair had been eyeing the dress lying along a fallen tree and had begun to take slow, meticulous steps towards it. Trying not to grab the attention of the prince, nor the woman aggressively shaking her foot on the tree. Stealthily, he slipped his sword out of its sheath and with a long, quick stretch, he picked up the dress on the tip of his sword. Reader, now realizing this was happening, shook her foot with more vigor, worried that this stupid tree was going to prevent her from returning Ochako's dress. The gypsy gave a short laugh, not able to contain himself any longer. He pointed the dress towards Reader and yelled, "My wife thanks you for this fine garment, miss." Reader gave a wicked glare and with one shake, her foot finally released from the vine. With a few more grumblings, she started to climb down once more and shouted at him, "You will give me back my dress, sir." The gypsy laughed at what he considered a silly order from the young woman, making her cheeks warm but filled her body with longing to give a smooth, sweet punch to his gypsy butt face. She watched as he turned around to the other gypsies and began to wave the dress around like a flag, causing the men to laugh loudly with him. All the while this was happening, Shudo was still trying to fight off the yellow hard gypsy. Reader was finally at a height that would be safe to fall from, but she had a different idea on her landing. Waiting for the perfect time, Reader pushed off of the tree trunk and jumped onto the back of the gypsy, forcing him to fall to the ground, but giving Reader a softer place to land on. As quickly as she fell, she jumped and grabbed the man's sword, but, to her dismay, another gypsy had run over, wrapped her back tightly to his chest, and placed a dagger on her throat. Well, shit, she angrily thought in her head, upset that she let someone sneak up on her. Shudo, now finally noticing the current situation Reader was in, stood straight and with heaving breaths and waving his sword around tiredly said, "Let her go. Your quarrel is with me." The black-haired gypsy turned to the man still holding onto Reader. He crossed his arms in thought, but he eventually nodded in affirmation and asked the gypsy to release her. Still seething with anger, once released, Reader turned and pushed the gypsy who grabbed her. Assuming that this black-haired gypsy was most likely the leader, she turned back to him with intensely furrowed brows. Letting her inner woman of power take over, she began her demands. "I insist you return my things at once." She took a step towards the man, glaring daggers into his very soul, "And since you deprive me of my I demand a horse as well." All the men, including Shudo, looked at her with raised eyebrows before the gypsy leader gave an appreciative laugh. Shudo continued to stare at Reader, wondering how it was so easy for her to take control of a situation like that. To defend herself in such a way made Shudo's heart soar. He finally found someone he could look up to, someone who was not his mother or sister. someone worthy to help him lead a country. The black-haired gypsy brought his index finger to his chin, acting as if he was contemplating a heavy decision. Reader tried to hold in her impatience, but a huff of annoyance fell through her lips anyway, making the gypsy man smile at her with amusement. "Milady," he bowed in an over-exaggerated way before righting himself and waved his hand around the clearing, "you may have anything you can carry." The men were chuckling, but Reader looked back at the prince, giving him a once-over and not realizing the slight pink on his cheeks from her observant gaze. She returned her attention back to the leader and asked, "May I have your word on that, sir?" The gypsy chuckled and declared, "On my honor as a gypsy, whatever you can carry." He waved his arms around while Reader began to roll her shoulders and stretch out her legs slightly. This made Shudo morph his face into a fascinated confusion that stayed as he watched Reader walk up to him slowly. Reader bent her knees slightly, grabbed hold of the prince's left arm and moved it so it was over her. She bent at a 90-degree and lifted Shudo onto her back, laying him down on his stomach. The men laughed all around her as she used all of her strength to begin carrying Shudo out of the clearing. Shudo's mouth was wide open, unable to fathom a countess having this type of strength, but would it be weird if he said he liked this? As Reader walked away, Shudo waved slightly at the gypsy men as she passed them by, completely embracing this situation. The gypsy leader, between large bellows of laughter, began to call them to come back and promise a horse. At the sound of that she stopped and placed Shudo carefully back onto the ground. Too afraid to see the look on his face, she lifted her chin and began marching back to the leader with Shudo walking closely behind her. When she finally stopped in front of the black-haired gypsy, she crossed her arms haughtily and said, "Now we have a deal." The gypsy camp was far more organized than Reader had thought it was going to be. Tents, blankets, and tree stumps surrounded a large bonfire that was almost as tall as her. She had never seen a fire so large, but with the cold breeze that came with the darkness of night, the heat was far more pleasant than the sorry excuse she had as a fireplace at home. For a moment she wondered if it would be easy to just leave everything behind and join the gypsies. That dream did not last very long as she could not bear to leave her beloved manor to her stepmother and sister, Cammy. The gypsy leader, now known as Ciro, led Shudo and Reader over to an already laid-out blanket. Once the two of them sat down, the yellow-haired gypsy, Denki, excitedly brought over 2 other blankets for the two to use in case the fire was not enough. At this point, Reader was beyond content because this is the warmest she has ever been besides working in the summer heat, and she is drenched in sweat. That is not even close to how wonderful the flames warm her face and body. As Shudo and Reader chatted as the rest of the gypsies settled, a few started to play upbeat music and pass out wine. Shudo could not help but question where they had procured all these nicely constructed instruments and fine wine, but he could not deny that the gypsies knew how to throw a party. He began to tap along to the music as Reader began to ask if he had ever played rock, paper, and scissors. Taking her challenge, he decided to add a rule that whoever lost would have to confess something about themselves. "You are reading my thoughts, milord," Reader giggled as she took a sip of her wine. The two by this time have finished quite a few rounds of their game. At this point both Shudo and Reader had enough wine to add color to their cheeks and make them a lot more casual with each other. "And they're as fuzzy as my own, Countess," smirked Shudo as he took a drink of his wine. "Then Muzudafu concedes?" "Never." The two laughed as they placed their cups down. Shudo and Reader leaned close to each other. With a conspiratorial smile that made Reader's chest warm, Shudo looked right into her eyes and loudly whispered, "My next choice will be paper." They both laughed loudly again as they readied their hands for another round of rock, paper, scissors. In synchronization, they tapped their fists twice before showing their chosen weapon. While Shudo chose to use rock instead of paper, Reader chose paper, making her the winner of this round. Reader leaned back on her hands with her given blanket still wrapped around her arms and challenged, "It is your turn, and it better be good." She gave Shudo a smirk as he thought for a minute or so of what he was going to say this time. Reader was able to tell as soon as he decided when he turned very serious, and she was being graced with the frown that many people have complained about. "I have no longing to be king." Reader raised her eyebrows at Shudo's blunt answer. It was as if he has said it before, but has always been guided to a conclusion he was never happy about. Reader got a rush of empathy towards the prince, but that did not mean she would try to counsel him in her own way. Maybe it could help him. Oh, she sighed and she continued dreamily, but think of all the wonderful things you could do for the country. For the world. Shudo's eyebrows scrunched as he shook his head slightly and explained, yes, but to be so defined by your position. Reader watched intently as she leaned forward, hung on his words. It seemed as if the prince was finally entrusting her to his true thoughts, thus making her heart beat faster. To never be seen as who you are, but what you are. You have no idea how insufferable that is. Without thinking, Reader huffed in amusement and breezily said, you might be surprised. Shudo raised his eyebrows in surprise at the honesty in her tone. When he asked her, really, her cheeks flushed in embarrassment as she tried to figure a way to get out of the large hole she just dug herself in. With a quick glance around her, she knew exactly what to say. Clearing her throat, she said, a gypsy, for example, is rarely painted as anything else. They're defined by their status as your title defines you, yet it is not who they are. Shudo kept eye contact with her as she finished. You have been born to privilege, and with that comes specific obligations. Shudo let out a soft chuckle hearing those words from a woman who is not his sister, but a woman who is as smart as his sister, but is far wiser than he is. For some reason hearing those words from her voice made them more clear to Shudo. It felt like he was flying in her presence, going too high off the ground, but she was always there to keep him tied down. The line to his kite. Reader grinned at the sound of Shudo's exasperated chuckle and felt the need to apologize. I am sorry. My mouth has run away with me again. Shudo's head shook once more as he chuckled once again. Softened as he glanced at Reader's lips and back to her eyes and assured, no, milady. It is your mouth that has me hypnotized. Reader's face flushed at a ridiculous rate as she watched with wide eyes as Shudo slowly leaned forward. With a quick, silent glance back to her eyes, a silent question of approval, Reader closed the rest of the gap, meeting her lips to Shudo's. It was like a large lightning strike flashed through her body when their lips met, making her immediately forget where she was, who was with her, what chores she needed to do. All she felt, saw, and heard was Shudo. The kiss grew deeper and incredibly passionate as the two lost themselves in each other, making them unaware of the silence that now surrounded them as the gypsies watched with glee at the two young lovebirds. Hardly able to contain himself any longer, Denki, from the other side of the fire, began to laugh loudly. With Denki's high spirits, everyone joined in with laughs and whistles, finally capturing the attention of Reader and Shudo. The two quickly separated, flushed in shock and embarrassment. After a few seconds, Reader did not care that they saw any more and began to genuinely laugh along with them. Shudo watched her in admiration and began to laugh as well. Then an idea sparked in his head when the music began once again and, to his happiness, was a smooth and slow song that he remembers his mother humming to him when he was little and she was still living at home. Shudo quickly jumped to his feet, grabbed Reader by the hand, lifting her up with him. Reader smiled at him as he placed his right arm on the small of her back and held her right hand with his right. She placed her left arm on his shoulder, trying to calm her rushing heart, and thanking her father for teaching her to dance a little when she was young. She remembered how fun it was to stand on his feet as he led her around the sitting room by the fire. After they were both settled, Shudo began to lead her in a waltz, staying in their little spot. Reader looked up at the first man she has ever loved more than her father, and felt her heart fill with happiness. She forced away the worries about how late she would be home or how upset Namuri would be with her absence. All she thought about was Shudo and how close she was to him. Thus, bringing their lips together once more as they slowly turned in circles.